commission members here, and we have 2 more joining us in Albany. Can you hear us in Albany? I see Ann nodding yes. I don't think we can hear you yet.
They have their microphone muted.
Can they unmute it if they need to, Jim?
Peter and Barry.
They can.
Okay.
They have to.
How about now, Mike? Can you hear us?
Yes, that's much better. Thank you. All right, and I see we now have 3 commission members in Albany. We've got, looks like D.A. Murphy, Superintendent D'Amico, and we've got Ann Willie. And I think we have at least 2 more commission members who are on their way, but we do have 1 commission member who needs to leave by 11:45 or 12, so I think we better get started. The first thing we have are welcome and introductions. Welcome, everyone. By way of introductions, we do have with us today the Governor's Deputy Secretary for Public Safety, Thomas Apt. He's relatively new in the job, is also my boss. I wanted to introduce him. Thomas is here. Comes to us from the Justice Department, from the White House before that. Spent time in private practice in New York, spent time in the New York County DA's office. So certainly brings a great deal of experience to the job. And so far it's been a pleasure for me to work with. And he's very interested in forensic science, the work of the commission. So welcome, we're happy to have you. The next order of business we have is approval of the meeting agenda. What I would ask is that I would ask for a motion to approve the agenda with the caveat that seeing D.A. Fitzpatrick has to leave before noon, and commission members Scheck and Neufeld aren't here yet. I would ask that we have the flexibility, if we need to move matters in the old business up, if we need to do that, to get to them before noon. So we'll start in the order things are, but I just ask that the motion give me the leeway to move the old business items up during the course of the meeting if we need to do that. Do we have a motion in that regard?
So moved.
All right, do we have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye. Aye.
Anyone opposed? All right, thank you. The next order of business we have is the review and approval of the minutes of our October 16th, 2013 meeting. Those minutes were circulated. Is there any discussion? If not, do we have a motion to approve those minutes? Do we have a second? And all in favor? Anybody opposed? It carries. The next item on our agenda is lab accreditations and/or updates. Brian, you want to take us through those?
Sure. The first item on the agenda under lab accreditation updates is the New York State Police Crime Laboratory. We have Ray Wickenheisen up in Albany and Tim Monroe from the State Police.
Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning.
Just as a quick summary, they have undergone their ISO inspection. They have remediated any issues that were identified. The DNA subcommittee made a binding recommendation at the last meeting on November 15th. All of that information is actually in there. The one difference in this accreditation is the lab, prior to this, the state police was 4 labs. Now they're considered 1 laboratory system, so it's just a change in how ASPAT processed their application. So now that's essentially it. All the documents are in the binder.
Does anyone have any questions for the state police
I just have
department?
not so much for the state police. We have a number of letters involving the New York State Police with respect to other matters.
Referring to the disclosures?
Right, disclosures. That's in a different section of the agenda.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I suppose it, yeah, we will be dealing with
Okay.
it later, but if
That's
you
fine.
feel it's relevant
No.
here, okay. All right, any other questions, comments? All right, if not, do we have a motion to grant the New York State Police Crime Laboratory System accreditation in controlled substances, quantitative analysis, general chemical testing, clandestine laboratory analysis, human performance forensic toxicology, nuclear DNA, body fluid identification, individual characteristic database, hair, screening only, paint, glass, fire debris, general physical and chemical analysis, firearms, latent print processing, latent print comparison, impression evidence, specifically footwear and tires, and serial number restoration for a period mirroring their ISO accreditation.
So moved.
All right, do we have a second? All right, all in favor? Anyone opposed? All right, and I note that
Mike, I'm gonna abstain on it.
I was just gonna note that,
Abstain.
all right, we have two abstentions. We have Marvin and Superintendent D'Amico. What's our next item? All right, it's the next.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. The next item on the agenda is the Onondaga County Health Department Center for Forensic Sciences. They had their ASCLD International Surveillance Visit report. They recorded and closed. This is for informational purposes. There is no vote required.
Any questions or comments with regard to the Onondaga County Health Department Center for Forensic Sciences? All right.
The next item on the list is the forensic toxicology laboratory checklists. Essentially what happened is the American Board of Forensic Toxicology changed their guidelines, and each laboratory now has a new checklist they have to comply with. This is a self-evaluation. The laboratories listed here, which is the Onondaga Health Department Forensic Toxicology Laboratory, the Monroe County Office of the Medical Examiner Forensic Toxicology Laboratory, the Erie County Medical Examiner's Office Forensic Toxicology Laboratory, the Nassau County Office of the Medical Examiner Forensic Toxicology Laboratory, Suffolk County Office of the Chief Medical Examiner Toxicology Laboratory, Westchester County Division of Labs and Research Forensic Tox Lab, and the New York City Office of Chief Medical Examiner Forensic Toxicology Laboratory have all submitted their self-evaluations, and they're all showing compliance with the new ABFT checklist. Again, this is for informational purposes. There is no vote required.
Marina, was there anything that you wanted to add on this?
No, Brian pretty much summed it up. This new checklist became effective November 1st. And of course, all the laboratories that are being accredited after November 1st need to follow the checklist. The New York State labs were still, the last inspection was on the old list, but we did have to submit this list to show, this self-evaluation list to show that we're in compliance, and that's pretty much what it is.
Any questions or comments with regard to this issue?
Yeah, just a comment. I'd like to express appreciation to the ABFT and to the accredited labs for updating the standards. It was a significant undertaking.
It was long in coming, but yes, I agree with you, it was significant.
And the fact that each provided, its self-assessment of compliance, that was unexpected and again, very much appreciated. In comparing ABFT to ASCLD Lab, there are differences. Each program has its strengths and weaknesses. I do hope that the Commission moves forward with the establishment of a Quality Assurance Committee or Council to identify those lab practices that are key to the integrity of lab services, and to establish minimum requirements that are consistent between the programs. But again, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions with regard to this issue?
Okay. The next item on the agenda is the Erie County Central Police Services Forensic Laboratory. I believe Dr. Simich is in Albany. Essentially, we have documents that are received that are part of the remediation of their international assessment that they just underwent. Again, there's no vote needed. It's purely for informational purposes. If there's questions for Dr. Simich?
Any questions or comments?
Okay, thank you, John. Next item on the agenda, New York City Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, Department of Forensic Biology, and essentially there is a minor finding from their August surveillance visit. We have Mr. Cooper Schmidt and Eugene Lean and Meredith Rosenberg from the Office of Chief Medical Examiner Lab. They're present here in New York City. There's a letter in the binder just addressing that, and also the appointment of Meredith Rosenberg, who is the new QA manager. So the documents are in the binder. I'm not sure if there's any questions regarding that.
What tab?
I'm sorry?
What tab?
Okay, if you actually go under,
Oh,
there's the accreditation tab and
Right
OCME.
before old business. Before.
Got it, thank you.
Sure. Any questions for that?
You need a minute, Marvin?
My only question is, what is a general forensic science lecture?
Well, the general forensic science lecture, and I'll answer this because that was under my tenure as the quality assurance manager. The general forensic science lecture that we have prepared is something that gives an introduction to all the trainees, all the new people that come into our laboratory, to give them an overview of what forensics is. And it's not just concentrated on DNA, which is what our laboratory does. It's various disciplines such as criminalistics, ballistics, some remedial knowledge of what other people do is essential in making a good forensic scientist. So we have, fortunately, on staff, a criminalist level 4 who did this presentation for us. He was the author of 2 books that you can purchase at any bookstore, I believe. And he gave it to the laboratory, and we have 1 or 2 people that we do need to give it to by the end of the year, and we plan on doing that, and we can close this out, and we'll send a letter to ASCO Lab to document that, and it will be forwarded to you as well.
Other questions, comments?
Did I understand correctly? Now, Eugene is no longer the QA manager?
That's right. The second letter in your binder appoints Meredith as the quality manager as of November
Because I
1st.
thought for a while that both of you were.
I was sort of shadowing him so that I
Oh,
could
okay.
learn the ropes.
I'm sorry.
All right, thank you. I think you might as well stay here, because I think that takes care of our lab accreditation updates, does it not?
Yep.
This is for Peter. This is for Peter. From Devin. Devin. I think that's the bear stuff.
Yeah, did we give them time?
Yeah, I think we did. I think we went through that.
All right.
If you want me to do.
No, yeah, we'll just wait on that. All right, so,
If we just keep in the normal order.
yeah. Okay, so we'll move to old business at this point. The first item that we have on our agenda with regard to old business relates to the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, Department of Forensic Biology, and it pertains to a letter dated October 22nd, 2013, to the chair of the commission. At our last meeting, commission members had some follow-up questions about a laboratory disclosure. The letter from the lab director was a letter, I believe, attempting to clarify those issues. We have Mr. Cooper Schmidt here if there are any additional questions anyone has. Barry?
Thank you very much for providing these details. I know that I said something about how we really wanted to hear about it, and so I'm very pleased that you did it. I have a question about cases 3 and 4 here, both of which seem to involve errors at the TPOXX locus. They're Bronx cases, and there was a DNA profile hit in the Virginia database with respect to both of them. Were these the same profile?
No. Not to my knowledge.
Boy, that strikes me as quite an extraordinary coincidence.
Is that your knowledge? They're different, right?
Barry, in number 3, the Bronx County.
If I could just ask, I apologize, just identify yourselves.
And also, if it's possible to approach the table because the mic won't pick you up. Thank you.
My name is Mimi Mayers. I'm an attorney at the Medical Examiner's Office. Barry, number 3 in the letter is a Bronx County case. It's an April 1998 homicide.
All right.
And number 4 in the office's letter is a Bronx County case. It's a June 1996 sexual assault. These were separate, distinct crimes, and the 2 profiles that were developed are not the same profile.
Yeah, it's, okay. I mean, looking at it, they both, and apparently both got hits in the Virginia database. Well, maybe it's a gang. I mean, There's something going on there.
They have a big database in Virginia.
Yeah, they do. Now, I was surprised, frankly, to see that so many of these were actually errors that came out of the forensic analysis, and they weren't just transcription errors from the offender profile. With respect to I guess there was a later analysis that I saw here that you still believe that they were handwriting errors and they had nothing to do with the analysis of the actual.
That's correct.
And you decided, Mimi, that the law, just out of curiosity, you notified the two defense attorneys. So does that represent a judgment that the city council law required that? I'm just curious if that's why you did it.
We did that, Barry, in response to, I believe, your and Mr. Neufeld's request that the Office of Chief Medical Examiner, though the legislation that you're referring to is not yet formally in effect, that we honor the spirit of that legislation. And our Chief Medical Examiner, Dr. Sampson, absolutely supported your request. So, and as we indicated in an additional letter to the Commission dated October 30th, we did notify the two defense counsel in 2 of the 6 cases where someone was arrested and indicted in the endless mismatches.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate that.
And also to be clear, and we indicated in our letter, we have notified both the mayor's office and also the chair of the New York City Council Committee on Health of these endless mismatches and also of the Estes 1 mismatches.
And I should just share for the commission that I did call the FBI, and interestingly, this represents not just 12 out of 13 loci. This represents 9 of 10, 10 of 11, 11 of 12, 12 of 13. So apparently they did this in a batch for the whole country. So, thank you very much for doing that. Oh, I had one last question. I know you indicate that these errors represent a very small percentage of the number of loci that, the number of uploads that you make into CODIS, but that actually doesn't seem to me all that persuasive because you have no idea whether all the uploads into CODIS are right. Now, I presume they're right. Did you give any thought to doing some kind of random stratified audit of your other uploads to make sure that there were no other errors other than the ones that the FBI located here?
Our CODIS group actually does internal audits consistently with what gets uploaded every 2 weeks. So we do, going forward, have internal audits routinely of profiles that are getting sent out.
But what do you mean? Could you explain what you mean?
I don't know precisely how the software is doing it, but they are double checking that there are no errors, that there's not additional information that's entered that shouldn't be there. There's no erroneous entries of profiles that are getting uploaded. So, and they're making sure that there is nothing that wasn't, there's no duplicates going up, there's nothing of that sort going.
But what about, I guess, since you've now moved to an automated system, right, and there's no longer any hand transcriptions, if that's what I understand, and for how long were there hand transcriptions? Quite a number of years.
Quite a number of years, yes.
So, I mean, have you gone back, you might consider going back and doing some random stratified audit of the hand transcriptions just to make sure that there aren't more errors? I mean, or have you done that? I don't know.
Well, the state expanded their search, which is what we're going to talk about a little later on, beyond what the national database did. So we looked at an additional 500 or so potential mismatches that was caught during that audit.
Oh. Right. But I guess it's one thing to have a single mismatch, you know, that brings the mistake to your attention, right? It's quite another to say, well, if people are misreading the handwriting, right, in these instances, you might consider, I mean, I don't want to pretend that I have this expertise, but there are people that do these kinds of audits that you know that did. I mean, it just seems to me that to answer the question, how many times did you make these errors, you might want to go back and at least do some kind of stratified audit of these handwritten samples, just because maybe it's not just a one locus mismatch. Maybe somebody misread two.
Yeah. How did you find these 6 cases?
These came in with the mismatch hits. So out of the, what was it, 500 cases, we had analysts in the laboratory who looked at every single, they pulled every single file, they compared the profile that we received from Endis to the profile that was in the case, and they determined if it was really a mismatch or if it wasn't a true mismatch, which the majority of them were 494 of them.
Let me clarify. These 500 came to our attention when the FBI imposed a one mismatch search nationwide. And these were the mismatches that came to us for review to determine whether or not they're truly mismatches or they're actual genomes that are actually different. So this was imposed by the FBI and forwarded to our attention. So we had done a little more digging, and these 6 cases came to be as true mismatch for whatever reason, transcriptional errors and such.
Okay, so these 6 cases, did you have a suspect profile?
I don't believe so. I think in one there might have been a name suspect.
In other words, how did they determine that there's a one loci mismatch
There was
if
an-
you didn't have a suspect profile?
Oh, it was a CODIS hit
To an offender.
to an offender.
Okay.
So within the Endis software itself, they are able to calibrate it, if you would, to indicate, let's check 13 locations of the DNA profile, and let's allow one location to be a mismatch, meaning a complete no match, and spit out that answer also. In the past, the FBI did not have this algorithm within their software, and the state did this a couple years ago as well. In doing that with the software, a whole bunch of hits came out nationwide, and these were the ones that were belonging to the OCME.
Barry, you remember when we discussed 5 years ago, 6 years ago, familial searching, and then I want to say Denise O'Donnell promulgated a protocol that if an inadvertent match came out, and you know, you and I both said, call it what it is, familial search. I'm wondering why these 6 cases wouldn't have come out under that protocol. I mean, obviously.
Oh, that's an interesting question.
I think that all depends on the differences in the program. I mean, you know, the familial searching, and I'm going to speak about the most ideal type, is when, you know, you have a parent and a child relationship. They share one of my alleles. My father shares one of my alleles, and my mother shares one of my alleles. So in terms of the software, when it spits out a match, it's a moderate match, moderate stringency match, meaning there's one allele that is the same as the other person. So that might be, and I'm speaking purely might because I'm not sure exactly what New York State is doing. That might be the differences in the algorithm that are saying that this is a familial search, but for us, it was a mismatch, meaning it was a no match at that location. That's when the FBI.
But the rest of the search was done under high stringency.
Yes.
So at every location, it's the same except for one.
What would happen today? Now you don't use handwriting anymore, so you've eliminated the possibility of this happening. What would happen today if you had if you developed a full profile, you put it in CODIS, and CODIS tells you we got a hit on 9 loci, but it's not the guy. What, if anything, do you do with that information, which would be, to me as a prosecutor, indicative of some type of relationship between...
Right. We follow the partial match law
Okay.
as is described.
But Bill's question, why why when the partial match regimen was put in, were these one locus mismatches, you know, what
Yeah,
not
how come they didn't
identified?
pop up?
Yeah.
I don't know. You'd
don't know if
probably
they
have to
have
ask the Albany CODIS administrator.
It might be
You
tougher
you
setting.
you just got told no hit. You weren't told that Joe Blow in Virginia is probably could be the
Correct.
guy or could be the
Correct.
guy's uncle or something.
Because the FBI, this is the first time that the FBI has done this one mismatch
Yeah.
stringency search. So prior to this, the FBI kept its threshold searching, looking for a perfect match. Therefore, we wouldn't have been, up until this summer, we wouldn't have known that there was this one mismatch search out there. Does that make sense?
But the state does it at the state level.
Yeah, well, now, when Eugene, you said that there was a period before the FBI did this, that the state did it?
Yes.
I don't remember that.
That was,
I don't remember ever knowing that.
we actually had a couple of hits that were generated. We also reported to Ascon Lab and the commission at the time. It was in-
2009?
Is that when the state started for the first time,
Yes.
2009?
Yes.
Yes.
And when the state started it in 2009, till the time the FBI called you, how many of these mismatches came up?
Well, I mean, when the state imposes a mismatch search,
Right.
that's when it comes up. So there's nothing continuous, and there's no continuous
Right.
data about that. I can't remember the exact numbers, but I do know that the state imposed a 13 locus search with one mismatch, 12 locus search with one mismatch, so far and so forth. So that generated a couple of hits, potential hits for us to review, and there were a couple confirmed hits that were transcriptional errors at that time that we corrected and we did report. to
Did you
the
guys
commission.
go down, I mean, because the CODIS is 10 to 13 loci, right?
Yes.
But the state is 6.
Yes.
So did the state actually do this for 5 of 6?
I think they stopped at a certain number. I believe it was,
They got down to 11 loci and then the software crashed. So
I got that in there.
that's the newest one. So back in 2009, they had gotten down to 10, 11, and then it crashed. So they have
Dr. Disman is in Albany.
continued on.
Larry
He
can
can
answer some
answer the
questions here.
questions.
And how many, out of
Larry
sheer,
Eastman, New York State Police. I was wondering if I could clarify some things about this last CODIS search.
yeah, that'd be-
This was a new search at state, a forensic versus offender, obviously. Prior to this, I think someone already mentioned, the software would not allow us to perform this particular search. We tried it once and it crashed the program. Last fall, they instituted or provided us CODIS 7.0, which has a new searching algorithm, which is much better. Since that time, we've been preparing to carry out this particular search by notifying the laboratories, putting protocols in place, and we're able to finally effect the search on October 7th. The search that we're talking about here is a 10-locus search allowing one mismatch. It was a new search, and because of that, we expected that we would get a few new hits. And in fact, on our first search, we hit across the state 947 times. Those cases are being dispositioned and resolved, and to date, about 40 of them look like they may be meaningful, but we don't have the final bottom line yet, because folks are still resolving and dispositioning these hits.
could you repeat those numbers
That's it.
again?
947.
So you're saying 947 one locus mismatches between what's reported by the LDIS, the local labs, of which there are, what, 8? Is that right?
Yes.
Compared to the state database. That's what you're telling us, Barry, right?
No, these are uploads from Elvis Laboratories. So whatever was in Elvis would have been uploaded to the state. So we have what's ever at Elvis.
Right, but what, whose note, when you say a state search, I assume that you're doing what the FBI did. You're notifying Elders, or the system as a whole is examining all cases where there was a one locus mismatch. And my question to you is, how low did you go? Was this 5 of 6, 6 of 7, 7 of 8?
No. 10 is the lowest. 10 is the lowest we've
Okay.
gone. Because of our experience in the past of crashing the system, we're proceeding very slowly. So we did this in October, and we're kind of waiting until the dust clears, but we can effect other searches at fewer loci if that's what is asked of us.
No, I didn't suggest it, I only asked. But what, but so so you're saying could you give us, that's not reported anywhere here, is it? Do we have a report on this? I didn't see it. So you're saying that you got how many mismatches and how many cases?
No, I believe you're misstating, because I don't think he indicated he got 900 mismatches.
No.
If I understand him correctly, what he's saying is in 900 and something instances, there was a profile in there that came within one loci out of 10 of a profile in the database they were searching against. Now, I think he indicated so far maybe 40 of those have some relevance, which would mean that the rest of them, it was just a coincidence. There were two profiles, and there was a difference at one loci, and they were different, they were unrelated, and they had no meaning. Does that, in layman's terms, sum up what you're indicating?
Well,
That's exactly correct.
And those,
I do believe that even that 40 number is going to be somewhat exaggerated.
well, when you say, I'm really not, so you're saying 946, that was your number? Did I hear that right?
947.
947. 947 instances, there was a one locus mismatch, and that went down as little as 9 of 10.
I think we have to be careful when we use the terms. And you're saying one locus mismatch. What do you mean?
I don't know. Yeah, maybe you can help me.
Because I think you're mixing terms here.
Maybe.
Can I want to just make it clear, there's a one locus mismatch, but at the other loci, it's still a moderate. So we're not saying that it's identical profiles except for at one locus. We're saying all the other loci, it's a moderate, which means one or both alleles might be similar. And then there's one where none of the alleles are similar. So we're not saying they're matches, there are matches and they're just off by one. They're probably not even matches. They're just medium stringency possible matches, which we look at and we say, okay, no, that is not a match. So the majority of them get dispositioned as not even being relevant because they're not matches. I don't know if am I getting that across?
Basically, what this 947, it gives you a reason to go back and relook at the case to check and see whether or not your initial interpretation was correct and these truly are not matches and there's no connection between them, or in the 6 cases that you reported to us, was there something that caused you to look at it and say, in fact, there was an error here, there's a match. Just to try and put it in context, how many cases were you given notice of, just roughly, that you went back and looked at? You gave us a very large number, right?
For the state 10 and
Yeah.
11, that was, there were 500 potential cases, and 4 of them,
Of those 500,
4 were actually,
496, there was no error, there was no nothing, and it just turned out they were unrelated profiles.
Coincidence, yeah.
4 of those 500, in fact, someone had mixed or improperly recorded a result at one loci, and it caused you to reevaluate your numbers. Is that right?
correct.
And if the 947 number that Dr. Dusman's giving us is in fact they fall in the same category as that 500 number that you
Yeah,
started.
right. 500
Not
come to
the
the
4.
OCME, the other 450 are the other 6 or
Right, the
7.
rest
But Kathleen just said something a little different than I understood the FBI. You said moderate stringency searches, right? The FBI reported back one locus mismatch on high stringency, right? So you're doing something broader here.
Much
Is that right?
Much broader, yes.
Much broader. So it's
This is a
not the
quality
same
assurance
thing at
tool,
all.
Barry.
What?
This is a quality assurance tool that the state police was doing to allow, to just see if anything fell through the cracks. This was a belt and suspenders approach. So, clearly from the forensic labs, it put a huge burden on them, but they assume that burden because they want to make sure that they're not missing anything. But ultimately, a huge percentage, probably in the 99 point something percentage of it, is going to turn out to be just flotsam and jetsam. And essentially, you're going to see if that quality assurance tool identifies as it did in this case. And just again, to put it in perspective, the OCME is one of the largest CODIS uploaders in the country. So, this is still a small percentage.
Please don't, I'm not in any way being critical. I understand that this is a quality assurance program. I'm only asking questions to see if I can understand it.
No, and that's fine. I just don't want this 947 number. The way you were asking it, to me, sounded like the 947 number was being represented as the number of times where it was actually found that there was some type of mismatch or misrecording. And I don't think that's accurate. And I want to make sure we're all accurate in terms of what we're...
No, well.
So if you have questions, by all means, go ahead and answer.
Yeah, no, I think the distinction, Mike, is the difference here between a moderate stringency review and the high stringency review that the FBI was doing. I mean, these are two entirely different kinds of analyses.
And again, if you have questions...
And that's why the
go ahead and
number
answer.
is so much bigger, right? But you're also finding, I'm sure, more quote-unquote mismatches than just one locus, or is it just one locus? I mean, this 947 number represents something different,
This
doesn't
is
it?
still one locus.
If it's a moderate stringency
I
review.
think you've got to ask Dr. Dusman. If you're asking about the 947
Well, that's
number, I'd ask you
at
direct...
least that's how this started.
No, but I'm saying, if you have a question...
Well,
direct
yeah.
it to me.
So, Dr. Dusman?
I'm sorry, the conversation is exactly correct. I mean, these were 947 mismatches that were reported to the laboratories for dispositioning, and this was a moderate stringency search, so obviously there's not going to be, these are not direct, exact matches. And as a result of this disposition process, by far the largest number of them have been shown to be meaningless and been dispositioned as such.
Well, I mean, when you say meaningless, I mean, if by prejudice, and I'm sure we're all concerned about it, it's discovered that there was some kind of error in the casework, right? That is to say that when you reanalyze everything, you realize that there was some false positive or false negative here, okay? But why, if you're doing, I'm just, maybe it's not productive for me to ask all these questions offline, but, here, but it doesn't seem to me that how many errors are there within the different loci is really my question, and why are you getting them? Would be the kind of report, Dr. Dusman, I would imagine you would be producing for us. In other words, I was surprised out of just these 6 that came out from the FBI that so many of them came from forensic profiles. I thought they were just going to be transcription errors when somebody was actually doing the reference sample, but they weren't. Some of them came from DNA off a jacket, DNA from vaginal swabs, some of them from
All of them are forensic profiles.
All of them forensic profiles.
But that would make sense, because that's the largest number of ones that are put into the data bank. And also to clarify, there wouldn't be false positives, there would be false negatives.
False
There would only
negatives.
be ones that we missed, not we, meaning we, the state. But in that particular case, that's why this quality assurance measure is implemented, to make sure they don't miss any. So the good news is there's no false inclusions. What we're trying to do, and again, we being the royal we of the state, is trying to ensure that there's no false exclusions.
Yeah, it could be either.
Why don't we do this, unless anyone has any objection? Barry, if you have other questions, if you want
I do.
to talk to Dr.
This is a
Dusman.
different thing than the FBI.
Yeah, what I'm suggesting is, between now and the next meeting, if you want to correspond with Dr. Dusman, get other information, and if you want this added to the agenda for any purpose at the next meeting, I'd be more than happy to put it on.
So there's no problem with me calling Dr. Dusman and just asking him these questions?
I don't have a
That's
problem
okay
with
you?
Dr.
All right.
Dusman. Do you have any objection?
No, not at all.
Okay, thank you.
Don't take his call.
I'll have Fitzpatrick on the phone.
I just wanted to go back to the
Do you
two
want
cases.
Dr. Dusman for this?
No,
Okay.
this is a question to OCME's representatives here. The two cases, items number 3 and 4, in this letter of October 22nd, 2013, You indicated you were able to notify defense counsel. Is that correct?
Not in cases 3 and 4.
Okay,
Because in 3 and 4, no one has been arrested.
okay. The other ones were the ones.
Correct. In the letter dated October 22nd to the commission.
Right.
The first case that is listed,
New York
case
County.
number 1, there was an individual who was arrested and pled guilty. We notified defense counsel. And it is case number 5 that is listed, the Queens County case.
Right.
That is a case that we learned was in fact prosecuted by the United States Attorney's Office, and we similarly informed defense counsel in that case as well.
So here's my question. Was it difficult to find the defense counsel?
No, it was not.
Because we had this discussion previously about, and there was some resistance, as I remember, and it's my characterization on this issue of whether or not notifying defense counsel would be a big problem.
Well, I don't think we personally
No,
found
in-
that.
No, in one of the cases, Marvin, the U.S. Attorney provided us immediately
With
with
the
the
information.
name and contact number of defense counsel.
Right.
And I was able, in the other case, to learn from the clerk's office who had been the assigned counsel. And this was a case that was quite old, in the 90s, but was able to find, she's in my Rolodex now, a very helpful clerk in the county clerk's office.
And we were able to find the defense counsel even from that old case.
Yes.
Was there, with respect to those defense attorneys, were they cooperative? Did they? Or was it just a letter?
I sent a letter on behalf of the Office of Chief Medical Examiner, on behalf of the Director, and indicated that they should contact the assigned assistant, or if they had any further questions, they could contact me. I have not received any calls from either attorney.
And were either of the defense attorneys institutional providers?
No.
They were private counsel?
Yes.
Were they private counsel assigned 18B
I
or
don't know
federal?
the answer to that.
Just one question. The FBI instituted this weekly search. There were 166 cases found nationally. Do you know how the FBI has reacted to this exercise? Are the changes anticipated?
Well,
Quality
the
assurance program?
mismatch, the quality assurance measure is now always in the program to be able to search out any new mismatches that might come.
So this
in
wasn't a
service.
one-time
This is a
exercise, this is
one-time
now
thing.
recurring weekly, you'll be doing these
Well, no,
searches?
because the
No.
database contains the same DNA profiles. So if you conduct it weekly, you're going to just spit out the exact same ones. So the very first time that they do it, all of these mismatches are found and some came to our possession. But since this algorithm is now in the program, anything that is further uploaded will be subjected to the search also. So any new profiles will now be subject to this as well.
This was a one-time thing.
We shouldn't say that it's a one-time, we should say that this is the initiation of the quality assurance measure, which produced all of these hits initially. And now it's a continuous process to be able to find anything that's newly uploaded to it.
And no new ones have come to us since they started this process.
My understanding, talking to Alice Eisenberg, the CODIS administrator, is that they decided to do this one. I didn't know it was a software development, but they decided to do this one mismatch at high stringency, which is different than what the state's doing. Thank you. For all the cases historically, right, to see if basically they would come up with these transcription errors. And they did in 166 cases across the country. You know, so now the challenge for us is to figure out where they are, because this whole bureaucracy is set up where, the great advantage, at least here in New York State, is that we have this DNA hits program, so that the prosecutors in the city know. It's something, by the way, that should be instituted throughout the state. In other words, do we have that, by the way, Dr. Deuce, is he gone? Do you know, Mike, if the other prosecutors' offices in the state of New York are informed of every hit on older new cases at the same time as the local labs?
I don't believe so.
I would strongly suggest that that's something that is done everywhere in the state of New York.
Actually, where's the copy? The SCC.
The first one.
So, Barry, my understanding is the way it works for the local labs outside of New York City is the labs get the hit. We notify the police agencies and the district attorneys at the same time. We always notify both.
Of every kind of hit.
Of every hit. Every hit that's confirmed.
Right, from an old case or a new case.
Yes.
And well, all right, I mean, you do that, is it part of a software program as it is in New York? Maybe, Phil, you know the answer to this, I don't know.
The OCV can answer the question better, but the DNA hits, correct me if I'm wrong, the information is input by OCV Lab. That's not information that comes from the Estes, from the CODIS administrator over in the state. It comes down and they input it.
They input it, but they give it at this, so what you're telling me is that all the labs in New York, the moment that you get a hit on a new case or an old case, and by old I mean there was a forensic sample in there and now there's a hit to an offender that matches the forensic sample that wasn't known before, that automatically you not only tell the submitting agency, meaning the police department, but you're going to tell the prosecutor in that same jurisdiction.
That's correct.
And is that a software package, or is that just
I can't speak for all of the other labs. I know in our lab we do not have a software package. We manually send the letters to the respective agencies.
Just to commend OCME, what they did as we sat down and collaborated was they also used the DNA Hits program for direct matches, because there's a lot of distance between OCME and a case detective's case file. So that was really helpful to us in the NYPD, because we previously had been getting the direct match comparison identifications the old way. Also in the NYPD, working with OCME and with the Criminal Justice Coordinator, we take the DNA hits and feed that information directly into the case detective's folder, because it's electronic. We have a program called the Enterprise Case Management System. So we don't like the word fax and we don't like the word mail. So we try to do everything, and then there's a receipt and a record and a corresponding work that needs to be done on the case. So we'd be more than happy to kind of demonstrate how this works, but I really appreciate OCME using that for the direct matches also.
Yeah, I would think that that would be a good thing. I mean, is there some reason why the rest of the state couldn't do that as well?
I don't know. The only thing that comes to me off the top of my head is that that's one police agency, whereas most of us are dealing, like I have 21 police agencies,
Right.
so I'm not sure if it's doable. I don't know.
Right, and that was exactly, the DCJS actually sponsored the DNA Hits program for OCME when they implemented it. It's because they have one huge customer that they're able to do that so effectively. It's not as easy to do throughout the state. And I don't mean to curtail the conversation, but there's a tremendous amount of stuff we need to do.
All right, anything else for OCME on this particular issue? All right, thank you. All right, the next issue, and it's appropriate that Peter just walked in, is an update with regard to the New York State Hair Evaluation Work Group. At our last commission meeting, Peter raised an issue. He also provided us a memo regarding a proposed review of microscopic hair cases in New York. The commission did vote to create a working group. Several commission members on the working group to explore the topic. I understand that one of the things the working group has done is produced a hair survey. Kathy, do you want to say anything about the proposed survey?
It's just a survey that the working group worked on together. It's just a survey we were hoping to send out to the laboratories to get their input as to how difficult the project would be for them to go back and identify their hair comparison cases, and to go through, if they had to go through all their case files or not. So there's just a series of questions that we asked regarding that. We're asking them what kind of resources do they think would be necessary for them to go through that.
All right, and is the survey ready to go?
Well, I have a quick question. Catherine, does the survey that's in here reflect the changes that you made ultimately?
Yes.
Okay. the survey is somewhat ready to go. We all, I think, basically agree on this sort of compromise statement of the survey. We also agree, though, there needed to be a letter that went with the survey explaining why we're doing it. And, I mean, obviously the subcommittee could just do it if you want, or we could bring it to you. You should know there was some slight disagreement. Kathy drafted a letter, but the letter that Kathy drafted, I felt, omitted two very, very critical points. One of the points was that it explicitly suggested that we had no idea whether any errors had been made by New York State or New York local crime lab examiners in the area of hair microscopy testimony, when in fact I had introduced with the original October memorandum 2 examples of actual transcripts documenting precisely the same types of errors that the FBI said in their statement on the limits of science would be considered errors and would need remedial action. So number one, I felt that the letter had to be changed to reflect that reality, while explicitly commenting that we had made no determination as to the materiality of those errors, because materiality is a question for lawyers and judges somewhere else down the road. But I wanted to make that clear, that existed, number one. Number two, because we are trying to get cooperation from the different state and local laboratories that we regulate, I thought it was imperative that we remind them that both under AskLab and AskLab Lab, which we rely on as a commission, believes that as a matter of first instance, the responsibility of the duty to correct when these kinds of errors arise belongs first and foremost with the crime laboratories. Just to sort of, urge them to be as prompt and comprehensive in completing the survey. I thought that would be a very useful thing to do. After all, it was AskLab who sent out the April 2013 notification that they may require additional studies of local cases. Number two, that this was a classic issue where AskLab and AskLab Lab in its own ethics rules had explicitly talked about this particular duty. So if we reminded the people in the laboratories that both AskLab Lab and AskLab Lab have already in their writing explicitly required them to take action in situations like this, they would be more willing to respond to Brian's outreach more quickly and more comprehensively. And that's all. So the issue is, I would like the letter that goes out with the survey to be the one that Kathy initially drafted with my tweaks on those 2 matters. And whether or not you think that's a matter that should be voted on by this commission, we can do that. I have copies here of the letter. I have copies here of the actual transcripts, which I produced for all of you in October, which you've all seen in October. You have copies of the FBI statement on the limits of science, which makes it crystal clear that each of the instances that I presented in New York from New York examiners were instances where they were in fact making the same scientifically invalid, erroneous statements that had been made by FBI agents in other cases. So all the pieces were in place, and I would like that accompanying letter to go out with the survey. Whether you, Mike, thinks that that's something that we should vote on, we can vote on it, and I can present copies of it here. But I feel very strongly that we need to really, urge the folks in the laboratory community to take this very, very seriously, and not just look at it as, oh my God, it's going to be such a burden. Because there is no question that that duty to correct first and foremost belongs to the labs, not the lawyers, not the judges. If the error starts with the lab, they're the ones who have to correct it. And that's what this cover letter would address.
I guess, in just a minute, personally, dealing with the first point, I don't see why that has to go in there. I don't see why we have to, in a way, it's kind of like we're trying to create a certain mindset before they fill the survey out. I think the survey speaks for itself, and I don't think we need to give anyone any historical background or bias before they fill the survey out. And secondly, unless you have some indication that there's going to be resistance, frankly, I think the labs have been in New York that we accredit have been very cooperative. It's the head of the Crime Lab Directors Association who's helped develop this survey, and is one of the people behind the subcommittee that wants to send it out. So, unless we get some indication that there's going to be some resistance from the labs, I just don't see the need to, do any prompting. From all the indications I have is that, this is a step that the directors are behind. We may get to a point down the line when we say, okay, what do we do with this information? That we start to have a divergence of opinion. But I don't think we're there yet, and I don't think there's any need for it. Kathy?
That was basically what I was going to say. I mean, we've discussed this, the crime lab directors discussed this at our last meeting, and I think all the labs are on board with understanding our role in this survey. So I don't think we need to stress that in the letter. And just in regards to your point about my initial letter, I do think I had in there that while you had these transcripts from the Hare testimony, that what my point was that we weren't sure how it affected the outcome of the case. So, and I'm just saying, I don't think the commission really, as you pointed out, I think quite appropriately, it's not the commission or the labs to determine if it was material to the case. That's really left for the lawyers. So at this point, we're not asking about that. We're just asking, what it would take in order to do the survey. I think that's all the letter really needs to address.
Actually, Kathy, I have no disagreement with you that the materiality issue has not been decided, and that part of your letter is just fine. The problem was that you didn't just limit it to that the letter said in the same sentence that it hasn't even made clear that similar mistakes, forget the materiality issue, had ever occurred in New York, okay? And that's just not the case.
So wouldn't it be best then, I think the survey, in my opinion, and I don't know if everyone's had a chance to read it, kind of speaks for itself. So my feeling is, we can just have DCJS write, a very simple cover letter, here it is, can, send it to the labs. I really don't anticipate getting any resistance at all from the laboratories.
Well, let's do this one step at a time. The survey was provided to all the commission members. So just starting with the survey, putting aside the issue of the cover letter for a minute. Is there anyone that has any questions or comments on the survey before we vote on the issue of whether or not to send it out? All right. If there's no questions or comments, do I have a motion? And again, putting aside the issue of a cover, letter, memo, whatever, do I have a motion that we send the survey as prepared by this working group out to the labs?
So moved.
Do I have a second? All right, all in favor? Anybody opposed? All right, so that carries unanimously. Now, we have not provided any type of letter or cover memo. So it seems that we got a couple of choices. One is we can send the survey out because we've agreed to do that. If we can come to some type of agreement as to what goes in the letter, that's fine. But otherwise, I think we need to, if there's disagreement to the point where you think we need a vote, then I think we need to present something in writing to the commission members so the commission members can look at it and understand what they're voting on, and then we'll vote. So personally, I would say.
Michael, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying it needs a vote. What I'm saying is, what I said that's why I was asking for your input, that there were certain disagreements, and I said it could be left to the subcommittee to simply agree amongst the five of us on what the content of that little cover note should be. There's no question there should be some cover note. I don't think it's fair to people to ask them to conduct a survey without telling them what gave rise to this survey. I think it's rude not to do that.
It sounds to me like you have a disagreement as to what goes in there that you haven't been able to resolve to this point.
Well, no, but we haven't really tried, okay? I mean, I think already Kathy and I just at this conversation right now agreed that the issue of materiality doesn't belong in this statement at all because it hasn't been decided. But I think maybe Kathy would agree to eliminate the suggestion that there's not even an indication of any errors even been noticed in New York. Okay? And if that whole thing is taken out, perhaps we could simply truncate the actual quotes from AskLad Lab and AskLad with simply saying that, that the laboratories do acknowledge, a duty to correct, and it's in that spirit that we send you this letter. And so that's why I think that
Why don't you and
that
Kathy...
Kathy and I,
let me
perhaps
know-
working with Brian, could finalize a cover letter the next week that could then go out with the survey, if that's acceptable to the other members of the commission.
If you agree on one in the next week...
Right, then it
we'll
goes
put
out, the
cover-
committee, if the committee agrees, it just goes out. We don't have to come back here for a
Yeah,
vote.
if the full committee agrees on a cover letter within the next week, great, we'll send it
Yeah.
out with it. If you don't, we'll send the survey out.
Fine.
Is that acceptable?
Well,
Yes.
yeah.
Just some points I wanted to clarify, though, just when we talk about the duty to correct, I think clearly labs acknowledge that duty, but we're talking also here about the duty to identify, which is different. So I think we need to clarify that when we talk about this process. Also going back, when you're talking about the statements that are there, we're not sure that New York is going to agree to follow the same path as the FBI. Texas has not adopted the same path as the FBI. There's a correspondence from the FBI lab director within our commission binders that was sent specifically to the commission addressing this and saying that they make no comment about the way they're doing it, if we're doing it is right, or what the significance is. So I guess when you are forming that, and again, not to prolong this, but just, I think we just want to be cautious to make sure we don't rope ourselves in when we actually look at it.
No,
You know,
but
clearly
Jack-
some standards, if there's a misidentification, that's clearly an option, but I
Right.
think there's certain things that, I think there's not an agreement within the community, the forensic community, that the FBI has approached this in the best way.
I think these
So-
are all issues we're gonna have to
Sure.
deal with down the road. But
Fine.
I don't think we need to do them today. I think
Sure.
we send the survey out, get the results back, and then we'll have this discussion in
Okay.
terms of where we go. And I'm sure it will be a lively discussion. All right, the next issue we have, I believe, is an update with regard to report standardization.
Yeah. I'll make it brief because we have a lot of stuff that's going on today. We're running a little bit late. But essentially, what happened is all the twigs came together. They gave recommendations to NICLAC. NICLAC met in October. The lab directors went through those recommendations. There were some revisions that have been going back and forth and some additional work that was deemed necessary. So instead of waiting for the next regularly scheduled meetings, we've been having conference calls and meetings almost every month, several in the different disciplines, to try and move this along. At this point, the lab directors still have the documents from the twigs. They're going to be giving it back for one last 1 month review to make sure that the lab directors, who in some cases are technical specialists, in some cases aren't, have made policy decisions for the lab. They're going to push it back to the twigs. The twigs will have a month to come back with the final. And then, I'm thinking our timeline now moved a little bit, but I'm actually happy with the progress because there's been a fever pitch of going back and forth. There's been some heated discussions about issues that I think are valuable, including even where definitions will be kept. We've talked about this idea that all reports in the state of New York will have standardized definitions, and if they're not kept within the context of the report, they'll be kept on a website. So there's been lots, it's not a delaying tactic by any means. I think there's been some heated and productive discussions moving forward, trying to get some resolution. So now, unfortunately, the goalpost moved a little bit, but we're probably looking at mid-January. I think, I'm trying to think of the deadlines. I think NICLAC was going to get back to the twigs by the end of this month, and by the end of January, the twigs were going to have something back to us, and then I think we're going to be ready to kind of move forward.
When's our
When
next
is our
meeting
next-
after January?
Just asking, when is our next meeting?
I think the several commission member schedules just haven't got back yet, so it's going to be in end of March.
All right, will you have something?
this will be-
Yeah, we'll be able to have a much more detailed discussion at that time.
When do you think there'll be a report to the commission in advance of the actual book, so we can look at it? It's gonna be somewhat complicated.
Sure.
I hate to wait for the book to come out a week before March. So if you have a January, and I'm not holding you to it, but if you
Sure.
think it's in January, could we get it by February 1st?
Right, what happened is I'll keep people regularly updated as to the progress.
Right.
So that way you see where it is, and we'll try and give people advance notice as to what they're looking at.
Okay.
So that way it's not just a week in advance to look at
And I
something.
assume if we get it in February, we can respond to it?
Well, I think, in general, the responses usually are things that are commission discussions.
Right, but
Yeah,
if
I
I
think-
want to respond to it with suggestions and have that included in the the agenda items, we could do that.
We just have to make sure we do it in a way that doesn't constitute an off-the-books meeting where we're going back and forth between each other. So certainly, yeah, I think it's a great idea that this be circulated ahead of time so we can have a productive discussion. If people have things that they want to send back
To the commission.
send them to the commission. We can
To be
circulate them.
discussed
What we
later on.
can't do is have a back and forth outside of the context of the meeting. So let's do this. Can we at least as a goal shoot for, getting something, getting a final product that we can circulate to commission members far enough in advance of the next meeting so that we can have a review and a discussion?
And if for some reason we can't, you'll understand why. So that
Yeah,
we
That's what I'm
Can
saying,
I-
is a goal. I'm not saying,
Yeah.
that
I didn't hold anybody to a date.
I just wanted to say goal, only because if we meet, it's usually around the same time, the NICLAC and TWIG. So if there is an issue that really needs a meeting, it would probably be around that same time. So the goal will be there, and
Yeah.
we hope to meet it as best we can.
And just so we're clear, we're talking about standardized reporting of forensic conclusions.
Yes, and the thing that we've talked about, and we've been moving forward with all the technical working groups and with NICLAC, is that there'll be 3 parts to that. The first part will be set components to each report within each discipline. The second part of that would be standardized conclusions for positive, negative, inconclusives, disclaimers, qualifiers. The third part will be standardized definitions.
You're gonna actually use the term inconclusive.
During,
You're gonna use the term inconclusive.
there's times when it's
Well,
appropriate.
but the difference of the opinions, positive, negative, inconclusive. So it might not be the word inconclusive. It
Yeah.
might be an inconclusive result will be reported this way.
I mean, just
It's going to be different on each
I
discipline.
mean, just bear in mind that, I mean, one of the things that the NAS report said in 2009 is the word inconclusive itself is somewhat to save it in a report, because inconclusive means it's such a catch-all for so many different things that it would be a much better idea if instead of ever saying inconclusive, someone said the actual reason why you couldn't reach a result.
And that's actually
that's
part of
part
the
of it.
ASCLD standard requires, anytime the inconclusive statement is used, there has to be a very detailed qualifier explaining why that statement was used. That's part of the ASCLD standard.
Can I suggest that instead of arguing about something that we haven't seen yet, let's wait when they get it? That's the type of feedback, if something comes out in there that you feel, is inappropriate, that we should be refining, changing.
That's what we're
That's the
gonna
type
talk
of
about.
feedback we would want, and that's the discussion we can have. What they give us, certainly is subject to our review and debate and discussion. So, but I just think it'd be easier to do when we have it in front of us.
Right, there's just one, in that regard though, I noticed one report here, can't even remember where it was, about arson, and I got very confused because there was some dispute about whether it should have been reported as no ignitable chemical, something was found, what?
No ignitable liquid detected?
No ignitable liquid detected, and then there was a criticism that that should have been called inconclusive instead of no ignitable liquid detected.
Is you're talking, I'm not sure which case you're talking about.
It was
Is
here
State-
somewhere.
State
I'll
Police?
find it. This is in one of the ones that,
But that's the kind of thing that we're
Yeah,
trying
that
to
is-
do with this report wording, to make that consistent. That's actually what we're trying to do.
Across the
Yeah,
discipline.
Within a
Within
discipline,
a
across the
discipline and
state.
across the discipline.
Across the labs.
yeah.
Across the labs within a
So-
discipline.
Within the discipline.
And let's understand also that no one else in the world is doing this. So what we're doing is baby steps, we're moving forward, we're keeping things consistent, although that's a bad word, among where we are. And the idea is that the product will be the same if you have a laboratory in New York City, if you have a laboratory in Buffalo, if you have a lab in wherever. And this isn't going to be, this process will never end, not in my lifetime. It's going to be constantly improving. And this is the first step. This is a Herculean effort to get the first thing roped together, to get a guideline together, and, go from there.
This, to be specific, this was the New York State Police submission under your tab, New York State Police. And then when it, you'll see that there's a reference here to, under a corrective action, right? Under fire debris, I guess it's page 18 of 19 of November 12, 2013. It says the reporting guidelines inconclusive no ignitable liquid residues identified, and it seemed to be that the finding was that the fire debris reports include results that state, quote, no ignitable liquid identified. Through interviews, this opinion statement is meant to convey an inconclusive result. And then there are no follow-up statements in the report that clearly communicate the meaning of the statement and the reason for the inconclusive results. And then in the lab response, they talk about using the word inconclusive instead of no ignitable liquid identified. And that made no sense to me, because it seemed to me that the kind of thing we're striving to do is
the other way around.
If your finding is no ignitable liquids, you say no ignitable liquids. You don't say inconclusive. So I was really flummoxed by that. What Peter and I are trying to say is that what we found in all these forensic error cases over the years is that the term inconclusive is the one that's abused. That's where we're finding the mistakes in serology and all kinds of disciplines. And so people would be much better advised in rewriting these forensic protocols to literally just state the facts if you haven't come up with a result that you feel, you know.
I suppose one thing that I would ask, since you're still going into the final stages of this, is to engraft on top of what you've been discussing amongst yourselves as lab directors, the problem for the courtroom, which is what Barry's addressing. If the final report in an arson debris case says inconclusive, and it's given to 12 jurors who go into debate whether or not the defendant is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of setting this fire, inconclusive is not helpful unless there was huge direct and cross-examination, redirect and recross. On the other hand, if the conclusion is exactly what happened, which would be the truth, which is no ignitable liquid identified, then the jurors can go into the courtroom, into the jury room, and debate what it is they were given. That's what we're saying to you. And you know I've said this many, many times. The problem that we have is that these are forensic labs. Your product ends up in a courtroom. And that's why when we get to these final definitions, it's so important for you to think in terms of what a jury is going to do. It's almost like forget about us. Skip the defense attorney, skip the prosecutors. Pretend you had to give this report to 12 jurors. Which would be better, the term inconclusive or the term no ignitable liquid found?
And our goal, we are attempting to do that, and that's part of why we're having the definitions, because we feel like if you use terms, then they need to be defined, and that is what we're trying to do.
Right.
I mean, our goal is to try to do what you're saying. We're hoping we come close to, whatever we need.
Try to spend time on this now so that we don't have a raging debate and
I
argument about
think
this.
you both made the point very well, and I appreciate it. I think it's a very valid point. All right, anything else with regard to report standardization? All right, the next issue we have relates to the Inspector General's report that was issued with regard to the New York City Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, Department of Forensic Biology. I believe we do have the Inspector General, as well as, I believe it's the Executive Deputy Inspector General with us in Albany. So I guess before we start with any discussion, I would just ask if there's anything that the Inspector General or her office would like to either say or add with regard to the report.
No, but thanks for the opportunity.
All right. That being said, I guess the next thing I do is ask if there are any either comments with regard to the report or questions for OCME with regard to the report from commission members. Maybe if I could ask the representatives from OCME to come back to the table again, please.
So the question I have concerns the reporting of an event. When there's a non-conforming event found by the laboratory. And under the Askeladd Lab rules and regs, as I understand them, when you find evidence of a significant nonconformity, it's then you have 30 days to report it. That's how I understand the rule. In the years I've been here, almost every lab has followed that rule. They find the event, they report it, they then carry out an investigation. Sometimes the investigation is expanded, and we're kept up to date. But initially, upon discovery, as Askeladd Lab requires it, there has to be notification. Now, just so we're clear about the timelines, and if my dates are wrong, you'll tell me. In May of 2011, Askeladd Lab notified the OCME that it was now going to be accredited for the second time under the international standards. In June 27th, 2011, the commission met, and we voted to accredit the OCME pursuant to the recommendation from Askeladd Lab. In July 7th, 2011, 9 days after we voted to accredit, we received the first notification from OCME that there was a problem. The letter, July 7th, 2011, is noted on page 21 of the IG's report. Because the commission doesn't meet during the summer, the letter was not sent to all the commission members in July, but was given over to the commission members and put in the book that we receive and publish online for our October meeting. In September 2011, Dr. Prinz went before the DNA subcommittee and indicated that there was a problem. And then in October of 2011, at the commission's first meeting after the summer, Dr. Prinz appeared and told us there was a problem with Sarita Mitchell. In reading the report from the IG at page 20, there's an indication that on March 21st, 2011, there was a record of confirmed infractions citing two types of infraction. You're familiar with that. I assume you've all read the report. Am I correct? Right? You've read it. We know that those were two significant events because what I think we learned from the IG's report, and I've checked with only one other commission member, but we didn't know, was the extent of what Sarita Mitchell had done. Up until reading the IG's report, it was our belief that Sarita Mitchell had just missed stains, and you discovered them as events unfolded. But as page 20 of the IG report points out, it was much more significant than that. She had not only missed the stains, but she had indicated that she had tested for these stains, and in fact she hadn't. That's what page 20 says, and that's what the IG found. That's a pretty significant, we call that dry labbing. I mean, for all intents and purposes, she was lying. We know that you took it seriously because shortly thereafter, you presented her with charges almost immediately after March 21st. And you wouldn't have done that unless you were sure it was a pretty significant event. So if the rule was that you had to report 30 days after, that would have put it outside April 21st or April 25th. But the first time we heard about this was July 7th, 2011. And it's significant, this timeline and this business of reporting in real time when there's a significant event, because the first words out of Ms. Sampson's mouth when she went before the city council on the very first hearing was that the commission had been kept informed all along of everything that had been going on. Well, that was true insofar as July 7th all the way through to the time you testified before the commission. But in fact, when this commission voted on June 27th, 2011 to accredit the lab internationally, we did not know about this particular event of March 21st, these two significant events. Clearly, Dr. Prinz's letter of July 7th, 2011 doesn't even reveal the significance of the event. It alludes to the fact that there's a problem, but it's not even close to saying that we've uncovered dry ladder. So my question is this: what happened? What happened in March 21st, 2011 that we didn't get notified? Is there some reason? Did you read the rules differently than I'm reading them? Tell me what's going on.
I understand your concern, Marvin, and I'd like to explain the thought process during that time so that you can better understand what we were thinking of. Yes, you are right. In March 2011, we did discover that this technician had misidentified stains. If you look at ASCO Lab website, we do have to report significant events, but it does come under a more narrow scale. I believe in the legacy program, if it directly affects an essential criteria, we must report that within 30 days. For us, in terms of ASCO Lab International, again, if it goes against the criteria, we must report within 30 days. That being said, we needed to determine the extent of how significant, what the significance is we're talking about. Be reminded that these two cases were cases that she had done during training. No report had been issued yet. So there were no stakeholders that had been affected by an erroneous report. Okay? So because of these two cases, we started recalling the cases during her training, and that was about 20 cases. So it's a tremendous undertaking to be able to determine which cases she did, and with NYPD's assistance on this, we were able to get the evidence back, re-examine the evidence, along with the current case law that we have, to determine exactly what the extent of the damage is, if you will. By June, I want to say mid-June, we had determined that we need to go back to all of our cases. July 7th, if that date is correct, it is within the 30 days that we have discovered that we need to go back to all of the 800 cases or so that she had examined to make sure that whatever we had produced was correct.
So the issue is this. When you read an ASCLD lab rule that says there's a significant nonconformity and you have to report it within 30 days, you don't read that as meaning that we've discovered something, it looks bad, we've presented charges against an individual, but in your reading of the term significant nonconformity and in your reporting obligation, that doesn't kick in. You first will investigate further and keep going. Can you see, and that's what you're telling me, but that's what you did. And no one would argue with you that you shouldn't investigate.
Correct.
But that's not the issue. The issue is, under the ASCLD lab rules, international or otherwise, is to first report the event. And then you can do all the investigation and come back and say to us, you know something, that letter we sent you back on April 21st, we've done further investigation, it's not a problem. And you can see the flaw in the reasoning, because even you would have to concede, as the then quality manager, that had this commission known on June 27th, 2011, or had ASCLD lab known on May of 2011, that we had this March 21st incident, and that you were, at that point, initiating even more investigation, that it might have influenced your accreditation, might have influenced at least the debate before the commission, and certainly no one can argue that the commission didn't have all the facts at that time. Correct?
Marvin, if I can just interject.
Yeah. I'll take any answer. I really would like to hear from legal counsel as well,
Sure.
if I'm misreading the rules.
No, it's
at
just
all.
two corrections. These two errors occurred in training, right? Did not affect the casework, reports going out, etc. Dr. Prinz's plan, as she determined, as she decided, was to now examine these two kids, examine the other kids, the immediate 20, and see, was this a real problem? Now, there were no charges presented in March 2011. That didn't happen until July 2011. So, just to be clear. So the March 2011, March 21st to be precise, was the beginning of an investigation. Has this person been making mistakes, etc.?
Errors, to answer your question, errors that occur in training, we don't we don't consider a significant event, and neither does ASCLD.
If I can just jump in on that, and I apologize, and I want to also, just for clarity's sake,
That's,
if at any point, and I'll give it right back to you, Marvin,
Yeah.
if there's any point there's an allegation of misconduct, whether it be in training, whether it be anywhere, forging results, fudging results, and I'm not sure that happened, but the concern I have as well, I share Marvin's concern that when I read the IG report, there's 5 or 6 instances that were unknown to me, who had read all the documents. I'm sure they're unknown to ASCLD Lab, of misconduct, of the idea of someone either opening and sealing something again, maybe there's some ambiguity, potentially falsifying documentation, potentially falsifying results. To me, that's the emergency brake, that no matter what, that's an instant 30-day notification anywhere.
Brian, you're absolutely right, and we take that recommendation from the IG's office very seriously regarding that, the sealing. But when you're talking about training, when a person misses stains, is it malfeasance, or is it that she's not being as attentive as it is? And I'm speaking with a trainee in general.
Mm-hmm.
Is it a training issue that we need to correct right there and then to say, you know, there are more stains here that you did not find.
Mm-hmm.
Put them back into training, make sure that they find it so they can be a better forensic scientist, or did they purposefully not report something that was there? So that was the thought process that we had to determine to see whether or not it was a significant event at that point in time. And as Ms. Butcher pointed out, yes, we did determine that it was a significant event. We did file charges against her, and that's when we issued the letter to ASCLD Lab to the Commission.
Right, but just following up on that quick, on page 21, first paragraph of the IG report, the record of confirmed infraction regarding these 2 cases concluded it is unclear, quotes, it is unclear if Mitchell was simply improperly documenting the swab of evidence or actually falsifying her presumptive serology testing results. That's documented in a human resource form, and that's the part that concerns me, because that wasn't shared to us. And I understand completely that, did someone miss it, but it seemed to raise to the level that a supervisor said, we don't know if this person's falsifying data. That's a huge, maybe it's just a misstatement by a supervisor, an overstatement, but that's the part that concerns me, because it makes me believe that the system understood there was a problem with this and we didn't know that.
Right, but again, I understand the Commission's concerns on this one, and we'll take this as a learning lesson also for any future, God forbid, instances that might happen. But I mean, to use a very bad analogy, if I'm taking the assumption that somebody who buys a lotto ticket has a problem gambling, and just not even do any of the investigation myself and just reporting that, I think that's a malfeasance on my part, being the person that is jumping to a conclusion. So when a supervisor takes a look at whether or not, and is unclear whether or not the person is falsifying any information, we have to take a look at that. And we did. And we can't arrive at a reasonable conclusion that the person has done any malfeasance or made any false statements purposefully. So I think there's an evaluation process that you must consider when you're thinking about what to report.
So is it, I'm sorry, Catherine?
First of all, just so, understanding that when a person is being in training, now if you had a normal person coming into training, yes, we can understand it. This is not a normal situation. That Sarita Mitchell, you knew she did casework prior to this incident happening in March of 2011. So therefore, you should have immediately, in my opinion, known that there might have been a problem. And also on the 30-day reporting, you have that 30 days to investigate. And then even when you go back and look at when Ralph Keaton was here presenting to the commission, he did state, please, you're supposed to be reporting instances, even if it's not to a conclusion, and then they expect to be updated along the way. And if something drops off the radar because it is not that serious, then you carry it on like that. But you do not, not report because you don't have the time.
I do share your concern, and we will, like I said, God forbid this happens, if we can turn back time or anything like that, we might make a few changes. But in terms of Sarita Mitchell, to answer your concern, I haven't done evidence examination in a number of years. And if you throw me back in doing evidence examination, I'm not saying that I would make a mistake, but there might be things that I may need to relearn. Sarita Mitchell was taken off the casework early on. She was thrown back into the training program because management had decided so. I believe that we did an evaluation process to determine whether or not it was a significant event at that point in time, and then we determined to go back to the other cases. If by going to your logic, if I may, If we had determined that was a significant event, we didn't even need to check the 20 cases first. We should have just gone back to 800 cases, but we had to double check to make sure that all the T's are crossed and all the I's are dotted.
So is it your position today, knowing all that you now know, seeing the IG's report, and based upon the statements you just made, that you share our concern?
Yes.
And you're going to take it under advisement?
Absolutely.
Right? What I'm hearing is nothing's changed. If this happened today, and you found somebody in training with the background of Sarita Mitchell, right? Or even not with the background of Sarita Mitchell, somebody who's falsifying tapes, I mean, pretty basic. Somebody who's saying, I tested something but didn't test it, that your current position would be, that is not a significant event that bears immediate reporting.
I don't think, I think that's what you heard, but that's not what I said.
I disagree with that statement as well.
Well, instead of disagreeing, maybe you can tell me, what is your position today about reporting significant events? You know, this isn't the first time we've had the debate. I think I had it with you, Ms. I'm trying to remember who it was, Ms. Butcher, over the issue of what is a significant management change. You know, you and I differ on what's a significant management change in the structure of your organization. I hope to get to that today later. But, you know, it's almost like it's wordsmithing, which is what I do for a living, but not what scientists should be doing. I mean, if you find this today, you're now the new guy in charge. Are you going to report it to this commission?
Absolutely.
Or, immediately?
Immediately.
There's not going to be an investigation.
Well, absolutely, there'll be an investigation.
But the investigation is not going to prevent you from notifying us forthwith.
Within the 30 days, absolutely. The 30
Of
days,
discovery.
I believe, yes, is the time to figure out, is this real or is this not real? Or do we think it's real? If we think it's real, it gets reported.
Yeah.
That's why we report so much to you. We're
Now,
up here all the time.
We have a book today. We have a book today that we're working off of with a number of lab disclosures, where a number of labs around the state have found significant events, failure to keep notes simultaneously with the work, and the first thing the labs do, the first thing, was reported to us and to Aspod Lab. And then they conducted the investigation, continue to conduct the investigation, and try to figure out what's going on. So, I mean, the question for me, and I've raised this question from day one, I'm not happy with the timeline. I think the timeline was not good. I still think it leaves a very bad taste in my mouth that on June 27th, you got your accreditation and the commission didn't have the full record before it, whether you were investigating or not. So you say that's never going to happen again, and this is the second time we differ over the meaning of the word significant, and certainly I know that in the recent legislation passed by the City Council, as you know, the term significant is used in there. I just want to be sure that having gone through this miserable process that resulted in resignations, suspensions, firings, that we're not going to have this anymore. That you'll come here and be frank and forthwith and tell us what the hell's going on. Not hard.
I made that pledge to you at our first meeting.
I have a different but related point, and maybe the Inspector General can help me here as well. What concerns me, and it really, the first reference to it is on page 34 of the report, is the finding that Dr. Karajin, I guess it's Dr. Karajin, actually was able to, not only did she disagree with the report and rewrote it, but when an effort was made to find copies of the revisions and I guess the underlying materials, they were, it couldn't be done because, quote, after each revision, the computer program utilized by LCME overwrote the previous draft and only the most current draft remained. Now, there's a later footnote here that on July 2000...
What page you on?
Page 34. That in July of 2012, OCMA began using a LIMS system and that an audit log is maintained for each case, and the impression I'm getting is that you could no longer have an overwrite. Is that correct?
That's correct.
That-
Well, they'll be recorded with a time stamp, date stamp, who did the change, everything is recorded.
Right. Now, my concern has to do with how do we, I know that there's some significant litigation ongoing with respect to the development of the forensic statistical tool. And if I have this correct, Dr. Karagine and Dr. Adele Mitchell, right, were the primary researchers in this area, is that correct?
That's correct.
And there were issues raised in the course of this litigation with respect to the data that was used to create their validation studies. Are you aware of that?
No, sir.
Perhaps you should be. And my question is, and in fact, I think there was some answers that Dr. Mitchell gave in some of these hearings about certain data not being available when requested, underlying data with respect
Just to
to
be clear,
validation studies.
Barry, I think that you were referring to, there is an ongoing Fry hearing
Yeah.
in
In Brooklyn.
Kings County.
Right.
And where forensic statistical tool is at the part of that.
Yes.
And for the record, Judge Carruthers in New York County earlier this year presided over a full Fry hearing concerning forensic statistical tool and issued a decision about 6 weeks ago,
Yes.
finding that forensic statistical tool was generally accepted within the relevant scientific community.
I understand
So
that.
just for the record, there has been one full Fry hearing concluded in New York City concerning forensic statistical tool, and that decision, I can disseminate it to you if you'd like. And I believe that you're referring to a second separate Fry hearing that's ongoing in a different county before a different judge.
Right, and my point to you is very simply, first of all, that somebody finds that the methodology is generally accepted as reliable at a trial court level in a Fry hearing, is not, is we all know is not legally dispositive of the issue, but that's really not what I'm getting at. What I'm getting at is the underlying reliability of the data. I saw some excerpts from testimony in the case with respect to whether or not the underlying data was accurate and valid, and there were requests for some of this data that I think Dr. Mitchell said, well, we don't have that particular data available in the validation study, and I'm not going to try to in any way litigate that issue here, all right, because that's exactly what's going on in those cases is for the lawyers and for the judges. But our concern, which is quite relevant, which is raised by the Inspector General's report, is that when questions are being raised about the validation studies, right, and all the data in them, and presumably if those were compiled prior to July of 2012, right, before this LIMS system was in place, and maybe the LIMS system has nothing to do with the way that the research data is compiled, I have no idea. But I'm extremely concerned that the scientists that are developing this forensic statistical tool, one of them certainly, who's involved here in rewriting reports and then the drafts of that can't be found, that's a very significant problem that you as a lab, I think, have to, regardless of an adversary position in a court case, I mean, this is a sufficiently serious problem that I would strongly suggest that you go back and look at all those allegations made concerning whether or not all the data was there, whether it was accurate or anything else. You better do that right away, because you just fired this lady, and our Inspector General, in a very good report, has indicated that one of the issues here is that she rewrote somebody's results, and then you can't find the underlying data. If that doesn't send up a red flag, then you can't find the drafts. You can't find the drafts.
Can't find the drafts. The data was never a question. It's the interpretation of the data. Data was never falsified, never made up, never anything else.
We still have the
It's
data.
the data's there. It still exists. It's the interpretation of the data between Karagine and
Now, I
the others.
understand that. I'm saying that she rewrote it and the drafts were gone. That's the finding here, right?
That's correct.
All right. Now, When then somebody gets on the witness stand at a Fry hearing, right, and her colleague in particular is the one that I think I saw the questions and answers, and questions are raised about whether all the data that goes into the validation study was there, and some of it can't be found with respect, I think it had something to do with racial groups. Don't hold me to it. You should go look at it, not me. That's not my job here. That raises an immediate concern. So Mimi's quite right about what the judge's decision was, but that's not really the dispositive answer for you, given what we know now about what Dr. Karegin did. You know, the kind of thing that's troublesome, and one has seen it throughout the history of forensic science. It's even a factor sometimes in admissibility considerations. When your professional career depends, or it's your signal achievement, right, which it may well have been for her, the development of this forensic statistical tool, you know, and you actually are capable of doing what the Inspector General has made a finding happen here that you must have taken seriously. She was fired.
She resigned.
She resigned. Well, actually, I think on that one, it's a bit of wordsmithing, because if she didn't resign, you would have fired her, right?
She resigned.
Well, let's not get into that.
They also said there was names.
Right. Who?
You know, the head of the laboratory. And they must
Right,
have
right.
cared
Well,
as the fact
let's
that-
not get into that. That's there's the difference between resigning and firing somebody when it's clear that you would fire them is in my mind trivial. But the real issue for you is I really think that you should be going back and assuring us that everything about her underlying data with respect to the validation of the forensic statistical tool is on the up and up. Let's just put it that way. Don't wait for courts. Don't wait for courts, because, you know, this will eventually be investigated, and you should get out ahead of it. And I raise that for this very simple reason, Mike, and I know that we didn't have a meeting of the DNA subcommittee, and I tried to raise it then, but we didn't have a quorum the last time. I think that's what happened. All right. We are now at a point in this state, and it's a nationwide problem, where we have, when you're dealing with complex mixtures, we have OCME's forensic statistical tool. We have Dr. Dusemin and Perlin with their true allele. We have Armed Expert, right? I can't remember who's using that.
I think Erie County would like to use it.
Erie County wants to use it. And then we know that there's something called Lab Retriever that Nora Rudin and her gang are using to look at complex mixtures. And I'm telling you right now that when you have a complex DNA mixture with low template DNA, each of these different things can give you different results, each of these different methodologies. And that's ludicrous. You can't have that, right? That is a disaster for criminal investigation, that for the police, for innocent defendants being charged, for everybody. You know, you really can't have 4 different interpretations like this, I don't think, for very long. And that's the state we're in. And the reason I raise this so strenuously with respect to FST is that, you know, there's a cloud hanging over it because of Dr. Karegin's firing, and I think you really have to remove it by at least looking at the underlying data, regardless of where courts come out on whether or not the methodology is generally accepted as reliable.
Eugene looked at the underlying data before we brought it into casework during the validation process. We've done that. Independent eyes have looked at that data.
I just want to, before we go on, I want to correct one thing. Barry, I just want to correct, you indicated something about no quorum. There was a DNA subcommittee meeting, there was a quorum. I believe the specific item that you're referring to wasn't discussed because one of the members, or possibly the chair, wasn't available.
Oh, okay.
But there was a meeting, there was a quorum. I think you made your point. Marvin?
Also, may I just correct some?
Sure.
He
Yeah,
said,
if you can do it quickly. I don't want to debate
I know, but we
the
have
other
to have
issue.
a chance
If
to
it's-
respond to what are
Just-
misstatements.
yeah,
I don't want to make a misstatement about that.
Okay, so when this was discovered, when Dr. Sampson and I and Eugene discovered this, the matter of Dr. Karegin, we pulled every available case that she had ever reviewed and went through every single one. We had 3 separate scientists look at the interpretations and look at the original criminalist interpretations and make sure that each was valid.
Yeah, but
That was,
I just want you to make sure you have my point, all right?
I do,
I'm not
absolutely.
talking about, the Inspector General has put to rest, and I hope there was never any question, that when you have analysts disagreeing with each other about an interpretation, whether it be DNA or anything else, right, that has to be preserved. The district attorneys have to be notified if it becomes a criminal case. The defense has to have access to us, the courts. That's not an issue. We all understand that.
we certainly
That's a problem.
embrace all their recommendations.
But that's not my point. My point is, it's a simple matter of an audit, right?
We've done
And that is, no, well, I hope you've done, please don't say you've done something flippantly about this. What I'm suggesting to you, given the great importance of FST in the courts, and for this lab, frankly, in terms of its reputation, if she would do this in a case, rewriting the data, and the questions have been raised about the actual underlying data for the validation studies, I think you have to look into that. And I haven't heard you say you've done that. Have you done that?
Eugene has done that before we implemented.
I reviewed it. I reviewed that validation before we put it online for casework. We sent it to the DNA subcommittee for their review as well, and obviously the binding recommendation was sent to the commission. I don't know which specific circumstance you're talking about in which Dr. Mitchell had mentioned that we don't have the data available. I will look into that, and I can tell you that I will. But I also want to say that we're not flippant when it comes to doing an audit. We take matters very seriously. We went back to 800 cases that this analyst did.
I'm not saying that.
I know, I understand that.
I was
Yeah.
saying
And there were
that it shouldn't be a
57
flippant
cases.
answer in
It's
terms of,
not
I
flippant,
understand
please.
what you did look at, but
understand.
I'm trying to be as specific as I can, so you make sure if you choose to do it, you do, and if you don't do it, you don't do it. What I'm saying to you is that at these hearings, questions were raised about the underlying integrity of the validation studies, right? What went into them. I don't have those details. I'm not looking at it. I'm not a lawyer in the case. But you can't, you should be, it's not enough to say, frankly, Eugene, that you looked at it when it was created. You now know that the leading scientist involved in the development of FST, you had a fire because she essentially rewrote reports and got rid of the original drafts, or she resigned, all right, you can say resigned. That happened, okay? That's pretty significant, right? We had somebody in our office who did that, you know, we'd be looking at all their prior cases to see whether they reported data accurately. And in the most important initiative I would submit you have, you should go back and take a look at that. That's all I'm saying. And don't sit there going, oh, well, some judge found it was generally accepted as reliable, that's good enough. You should take seriously what critiques were made by the experts in that case and not rely upon the district attorneys to tell you that, because I'll tell you right now, as lawyers, we don't understand this stuff as well as the scientists, or we certainly aren't supposed to. And there's no one that can assure us about the integrity of the data and the validation studies the way you can. And
I can
that,
tell you that
I
I will-
understand, Dr. Butcher, you have not done, correct?
Ms.
What? Ms. Butcher, that you have not done, correct?
On the validation studies.
Since Carrageen was
behind-
exposed, you have, and since those hearings, you haven't gone back and looked at the underlying data and the questions that were raised about its integrity. That
Of the
that
FST
audit,
program.
yes,
No.
that has not been done. All
No,
right, I
wait,
suggest
I
you
have
do
not
that.
done it. I have
Others.
not done it.
I
I'm not
didn't-
qualified.
We've spent enough time to make the point like 3 times. I appreciate it. Marvin?
I just want to go back to page 34 of the IG's report and this footnote number 30 about the LIMS system, so I understand where we're at today. If today, Dr. Carrageen and others rewrote the report 2, 3, 4, 5 times, we would see evidence of that currently, as matters stand today. Right? You reprogrammed LIMS to do whatever it's supposed to do.
We didn't have limbs before this date.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. the product of limbs with respect to these reports, is it in the case file?
The audit trail?
Yeah.
No.
So here's my question. Because we do a lot of education for attorneys, both on the prosecution and the defense side. If you're going to prepare a case and you're a defense attorney or a prosecutor, and you want to take a look at the case file because you've been given a final report that says X, it's a match, where would you go to get this? How would you even know it existed if it's not in the case file? Let's say it's Mr. Fitzpatrick's line DA, calls you in, he's preparing a case in Onondaga County. Let's say it's a legal aid attorney in Kings County, preparing a case for trial in Supreme Court that has a forensics issue. I know the labs have been saying for several years now, and I don't know if this is now in effect, that they're giving the case file over, or giving notice.
Our report indicates
Right,
there's an
that you can get the
associated
case file. So that's good. So I would get the case file. I would call up the number on that big red thing that says on the final report, Mr. Schechter called this number. I get that. I get the case file. I come to your office. I look at it. I look at the final report. I look at the case file. I still have no idea that there was some fight going on behind closed doors. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct.
Okay. My next question is very specific, and I know that you want to move this along. As we sit here today, does the OCME have a written policy or template for how disagreements between technicians are recorded?
No.
Currently, if there's given this report, if there's a disagreement between A and B over the final conclusion, and then it's reconciled, how would anybody know about that?
That's exactly the recommendation of this report.
Right. So
we're looking into that.
Right. So if this commission, at some future date, adopts a policy for all labs in this state to follow, that they must have a recorded policy for how dissension, disagreements, discussions, differences of opinion, whatever you want to call it, between technicians about the result or conclusion, and regardless of how they are reconciled by a third supervisor or otherwise, that this be a written policy, that you have to show it, and there has to be an indication of it on the final report. Would you oppose that?
No.
You would not?
I would not.
So you would adopt that, that's really, I think, the recommendation of the IG.
It's a recommendation of the IG that this committee is supposed to make a recommendation and define that, yes, and we would not oppose that.
Just for your benefit, Mike, because you're the chair, I am going to make that motion. Not today. I'm asking that it be placed on the agenda for the March meeting. And at that time, I intend to work with Bill Fitzpatrick between now and then to draw up a motion for a policy that will embody what the IG recommends, so that at least in this state, where we're doing things for the first time that nobody else is doing with respect to uniform reporting, that at least in this state, we will have that policy. You should know that prior to this meeting, I reviewed all of the ASCLD lab manuals that I could find in existence. I can't find the ones from 30 years ago. But I went back, I looked at the current manual, the 2008 legacy, the 2010, and I've looked at the international supplemental manual. There is no requirement that I can find in ASCLD Lab's rules and regulations, in its policy guidelines, in its rules on ethics, that requires any lab to have a template or a written procedure for following when there is disagreement, discussion, etc., on conclusions between technicians.
And I tend to agree with you in principle. As I read the IG's report and I looked at all this situation, I think your example that you gave kind of hits the nail on the head. I don't see the issue so much as we need to define what a disagreement is. I think the bottom line is when a DA or a defense attorney goes to court, they need to know what happened. And they need to know if there was a difference of opinion. They need to, and so somehow that has to be reported. Whether it's reported in the notes as it happens, people document what they did, and that's all in the notes, and it gets turned over, whether it's recorded in a LIMS system, and that's included in the case file. You know, to me, the point is that somehow what happens in terms of work on that case and opinions people form along the way needs to be documented, and that documentation needs to be provided to the parties. So I think it would be reasonable for us as a commission to look at how we accomplish that goal. And I think it would be great that you and Bill take a look at that. But I also think, as I sit here and listen, it would be important for us to hear from the crime lab directors, you know, who, I think you and I are on the same page in terms of the end result, and that the parties going to court have to know what happened. And the crime lab directors somehow have to carry this out, come up with a procedure that gets that information to the parties. So maybe we should get input from them as well in terms of, do they have a proposal as to what the commission could adopt that would affect this result?
Well, I certainly have no objection to that. But what I don't want to happen is that we get to March and somebody raises their hand and says, let's kick this down the line for another 6 months while the crime labs get back to us. The much more...
I was contemplating acting today, so you suggest kicking it off to March. I think it's a good idea, because I think we can get some meaningful input, but I think we should act on it in March.
Right. One other thing that I would say to clarify your remarks, you're a former prosecutor. I have a current prosecutor to my right, and there's another one in Albany. It's not just that we need to know, but when there's a difference of opinion, one says it's a match and the other says it's not, there's a name for that in criminal law. It's called Brady. I mean, we're entitled to that information. The defense needs to know it, the judge needs to know it, and the prosecutor
I
needs to know
don't
it.
think there's anything I said that in any way
Took away from that.
got to a different
I just wanted
result.
the word Brady into the discussion.
Yeah, but what, you call it whatever you want. The bottom line is, if the case is going to go to court as a result of that lab work, the parties need to know. And I think it's incumbent on us as a commission to come up with procedures to make sure that happens.
In thinking of that, right, and I take your suggestion, Mike, that the labs have to help us here, because you don't want to get into a situation where people are arguing over what is a disagreement or not a disagreement, right? And you also don't want them to get into the situation that sometimes happens about, prior inconsistent statements of the witness, and everybody sits there and there's an oral statement being made and nobody writes it down because they don't want to write it down because...
That's my point exactly. It doesn't matter whether we call it a disagreement or not. Whatever you want to call it, the
we
people
want all
have
the
to know
data.
about it.
Yeah. And that really is a fundamental discovery data issue about getting all the underlying data. And there should be some way in this digital age that, we can just simply get all this stuff in real time, online, and you get access. I mean, to me, that's the ultimate solution to this problem in terms of getting all the data.
I don't know, did you make a motion, or do you want to make one?
Marvin and I,
I'm just going to meet with Bill.
We talked informally.
about
We're going to try to work something out.
We're going to work out something
My
and present it to you.
The IG's example is easy. You have a scientist saying it's, 2 people, and somebody else said it was 3 people, okay? And nobody changed their opinion. That stuff should have been made up. I don't want to create a situation where we stifle scientists.
Right.
And I think, Barry, you're making that point. I better keep my mouth shut, or I'm going to wind up being cross-examined. And Tim, don't agree with Marvin so easily in the future, okay? Because I don't want you to jump to that.
I agree in principle. The devil's in the details, obviously.
Yeah. This case is easy.
Let me,
It's too
can
late,
I
we
ask them,
agree.
when you two look at this issue, will you get input from the crime lab directors in terms of any recommendations you bring back to us for the March meeting?
I always talk to Dr. Corrado because I don't understand any of this crap, okay?
Great. All right.
You know what? You have an objection if I call Dr. Corrado.
I have no objection. Whether or not she takes your phone
That's
calls.
a whole other question.
All right. Anything else? Well, I have one other thing for the OCME. On page 20 and 21, you asked about before, there was indication that there was question as to whether or not something was improperly documented as opposed to actual falsifying of information results. Was that something that you were ever able to resolve in determining, with regard to Mitchell, were you able to say as a result of your review, that it was improper documentation, nothing more? Were you able to say she falsified, or was it a situation where you weren't able to tell?
No, we were able to tell.
what
The
was-
situation was resolved. She was not falsifying information. We were able to document everything that was within the realm of that report. I had first raised the question. We looked into it, and my question wasn't valid at all, whether or not she had done anything that was falsifying information.
But what was the explanation?
Her explanation is that, if you're talking about the resealing of the evidence, is that she did open it up, but she wanted to be neat in resealing it. So she, instead of having a huge piece of evidence tape and then recover it again, she sliced off the portions on the side and put it on it. Just coincidentally, it just matched. So now, we were able to resolve that because that was the only incident that ever occurred. So we went on.
And with respect to the swabs that she said she tested but were not tested?
Those, we recalled all the cases and we relooked everything. Again, when it comes to your concern of whether or not she actually falsified.
Right. What was her explanation for doing that? Saying I did it, but she didn't do it.
It was during training, and she had indicated that she had forgotten to document that. And we made it a training issue to make sure that she got retrained in kits, to ensure that she received 100% exactly what was, and our criteria, that she met it 100% to make sure that she documented every single thing.
Hey, Gene, just following up again on that. So the allegations from the IG's report that deliberately cite allegations of misconduct, those are all resolved and there is no misconduct in her?
We determined that there was no misconduct from her, yes.
Okay. Just to clarify also why my concern is on that, essentially a root cause and a corrective action have a very different tenor if there's misconduct versus incompetence. If someone is deliberately trying to subvert the quality management system, there's a completely different type of corrective action that's not just recalling cases that you might have to look at and other aspects of things they do. So at this point, though, you guys will attest that there is no misconduct
No,
in relation to this at all.
And a point of clarification, that IG's report did not raise the question of misconduct. They simply quoted from the supervisor's notes that it's either this or falsifying. So I just wanted to clarify that.
No, that's fine, but it's like kind of the sentence is half there without a period or crossing that, dotting the I's and crossing the T's, because it's hanging. And is there any documentation in the lab saying it's resolved?
I have to double check to see whether or not there's documentation, but like I said, we did review those the cases, and we re-examined those cases. So the re-examination of those case files the re-examination documentation are within the case files itself. If your question is pertaining to how we resolve the fact that she may have falsified information and determined that she did not, I have to double check into my notes to see whether or not we have that information.
But if she did, in fact, falsify the document, did not do the testing, and she just responded, well, I just forgot to put that in my notes, isn't that something that could have happened? And she just taking the lesser of two solutions there to the problem.
She was under a scope as of the time that we looked at or discovered that, and we sent her back into retraining for the.
But your conclusion is based on her response to that question. Did you?
Well, that was the only thing that we could go with, because evidence examination is a portion where we can't shadow a person to see exactly what they have done.
But it's still possible, isn't it, that she didn't?
Anything is possible. Anything is possible.
All right, do you have any other questions for OCME?
And I don't know if this might be for the IG or for OCME, but I just want to make sure I understand the timeline of the Serena Mitchell issue. So, from what I understand from the IG report, Dr. Shaler was in charge of the lab from 1990 to July of 2006. And Ms. Mitchell was hired in the year 2000. So she basically was having some issues for about 8 years until in October of 2008, there were 2 incidents that were pretty severe that you suspended her from casework. And it's pretty clear to me, being a lab director of a government laboratory, I understand that once a person has passed the probationary period, it's kind of difficult to terminate them. So it looks to me like in 2008, 2009, the lab director and the human resources department went down the path of this employee is an issue. We need to create some document. We need to give them the opportunity to see if they can pass these things or not. And if not, we need to document what their issues are so that you have cause possibly to terminate if it ends up she can't do the work. So I understand that. So basically it was in 2008 that you went down the road of trying to do something with this employee. But there were 3 corrective actions that I pulled out of the IG report. I just want to make sure I understand the dates of those. So it said on page 13 that sometime in 2011 you changed the rules for how your personnel evaluations were evaluated, so now they were seen by more people if there was a bad result in that. So that was put into place in 2011?
No. When I became interim director of the lab, I instituted changes in who reviewed the evaluations. Prior to that time, they were not always reviewed by Dr. Prince, the then director.
But they should have been?
They should have been, yes. Yeah,
Okay,
clearly.
so the IG report where it said sometime in 2011 the rule was changed that the evaluations were reviewed beyond the immediate supervisor, that's not the right
No, that
timeline?
is the case. Just beyond the immediate supervisor, there were assistant directors and, higher level, like CRIM 4s over CRIM 3, that did have had an additional review in some cases.
There's
Particularly- Go ahead.
I'm sorry. There's a signature spot on every single evaluation for the director to sign.
Okay.
And that's been the case for a long time.
Kathy, that was agency-wide. It was changed.
Okay, thank you. And then the stricter competency requirements, that is listed on page 25 in the report. Do we know when that was put into effect?
Oh, you're referring to Butcher's letter? The zero tolerance policy?
For the competency?
Oh, the competency? Stricter
It says-
competency requires as described in the zero tolerance policy.
But it says even prior to the corrective action at issue, the OCME, that's where I'm confused on the timeline. It sounds like there was stricter competency requirements that were put into place before the Butcher letter.
Yeah, I think that was in 2011.
Well, are they referring to only one case open at a time?
No, zero tolerance for people who fail to pass their training, all of their training.
Right.
I believe that was 2011?
2011, because it was based on the issues you noticed with this
Yeah.
other, okay. And then the last corrective action was that I know the laboratory increased the amount of cases they were doing reanalysis on as another way to possibly catch some of these issues before it happened again. And I believe the report said that was instituted in January of 2010.
No. We had, when I was interim director, I made it 25% of all evidence exam kits would now be retested as a quality assurance measure. Before it was 12 to 13%.
It was about 12.5%. If you remember, the commission asked us to do a reanalysis in January of 2010, or start a reanalysis program in January 2010. We've instituted that. And in January 2013, since Ms. Butcher was the interim director, that percentage was upped, doubled, from 12.5% to about 25%.
January of 2013?
That's correct.
Okay.
Or early, it might have been the first day of February.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much.
Any other questions or comments? I guess, in terms of where that leaves us, my recollection is the commission previously discussed asking ASQUAD Lab to do a management review with regard to the OCME Office of Forensic Biology. So one issue on the table is that something we want to continue with? And it seems to me, if so, the second issue we ought to look at is there anything in the IG's report we would want to ask them to look at in addition to the general management review. So I don't know if anyone has any thoughts or comments in that regard.
Well, at a minimum, has Askeladd Lab received the IG report from us? Have we sent it to them?
I believe the
I sent it to
OCME and Mr. Cooperson in particular sent it to them, and I think he sent us a copy of the correspondence, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, I made that one suggestion, which having to do with reviewing the questions that have been raised about the integrity of the data and the FST validation.
Yeah, I guess I look at it a little differently. I'm uncomfortable pulling Askeladd Lab into the FST work, but looking at it more broadly, I guess one thought I would have is that I don't know that it would be, there are issues raised in the IG's report with regard to record keeping and record retention. And, issues of something being removed from a file or a file not containing documentation. And it seems to me it might be reasonable to ask Askeladd Lab to look at whether or not procedures or policies are in place currently in the lab with regard to record retention, report retention. It would indicate that the lab is in compliance with Askeladd Lab standards in that regard.
Well, Mike, I think it's a broader issue, and that is that we live in a world where we review as much as possible. What happens is the crime lab performs various different tests and validates different assays. That's certainly part of what our crime labs do. What's interesting and laudatory with respect to OCME is that their forensic statistical tool, some had argued, may have had a superior approach in terms of trying to validate how you deal with low template DNA and mixtures. So it's an extremely important initiative as far as the country is concerned, and certainly as far as this city and all these cases go. So what was disturbing to me about this report is I can't recall an instance where in the development of any of the different methodologies with respect to the different permutations of forensic DNA testing that we actually, people might have disagreed about the inferences drawn, but I don't remember a scientist who was actually disciplined or resigned, I don't know what you want to call it, for fabricating a report in this fashion. And so if she's the lead scientist on this, and I'm just saying that when you have questions that are raised at a hearing, right, by another scientist, it's not really being raised by the defense lawyers, it's being raised by other scientists that they brought in to look at the data and see if it
But isn't that for the parties and the judge in the context of that hearing to deal with?
No, and that's really what I want to raise. That's what I'm saying. What I'm suggesting as specifically as I can, that when you have in the crucible of this hearing where you actually bring in other scientists to review something of this nature, then what has to happen is that the lab, regardless of what the lawyers say about where we're going to go with the judge or anything else, if the underlying data might not have been correct or was fudged or there was some problem with it, you're not going to find out about it unless you conduct the audit, and you have to take seriously what questions are raised. I'm not saying that, and then if it turned out something was wrong there, you have to report it to the courts.
So the judge who's heard all this had that concern, isn't it within his or her power to order that or direct that?
Well, a judge could reach out and do that, but that whole decision and everything else was done without this Inspector General's report.
Are you making a proposal, or what? I guess I'm not following what you're saying.
What I proposed directly,
Barry,
I
I'm sorry.
think.
Happy holidays, everybody.
Happy holidays. That's a war on Christmas comment, Fitzpatrick. You have to watch a little Fox News, don't you? What I tried to do.
Fair and balanced, is there?
That's what I'm trying to be, fair and balanced. What I thought we established in the questions to Ms. Butcher and everyone here, and I'm serious about this, that
No, I know
that
you
it's
are.
their responsibility to go back, I believe, and we as a commission, I'm not saying we have to vote on it, but I'm certainly raising it. When you have an employee that was disciplined for this kind of fabrication, that's what it is. No, I mean when Carrigan goes back and eliminates the dissenting results, and then you can't find the underlying things. I mean,
Yeah, I don't think it's a
I don't think it's
fabrication either.
fabrication.
all right, what do you want to call it?
Wait, I think this is like the fourth time you've gone through this, and all I'm asking, you've made a request of them before, and they can do with the request what they want. Do you have, if you're not
I
making any
actually
further
think-
motion,
I
then
actually-
fine. If you're making a motion, let's hear it and vote on it. I just, I want to cut to the chase here. What's the
Yeah, all
bottom
right,
line?
well, let me ask you this. I mean, are you guys intending to conduct that kind of review?
I want to read the transcript of what you're referring to. I need to know what data Adele said she doesn't have, or the context of that. I have no idea what that's
So,
about.
all right, in
It
fairness...
was on
then-
cross-examination by the defense attorney.
Can you
in
send it
Mitchell's-
to me?
Mitchell's testimony.
Can you
Well,
send it to me?
I mean,
In
look,
which
I,
hearing?
the Brooklyn hearing.
Why don't you provide us with what it is, and we'll look into it.
Okay.
All right, we will, then let's do it this way. We will provide you with questions that were raised about
I would
the underlying
appreciate that.
integrity, the validity. You just got here, so I appreciate that. And then, let's see if they agree to conduct, such an order in light of that, and if they don't, then I might have a
You put it
motion.
back on the agenda. Now, leaving aside those hearings, just generally speaking, with regard to the IG's report, again, we, as a commission, previously discussed asking ASCLD Lab to do a management review. Is that something we want to pursue as a commission, or no, given the fact we've all had a chance to look at the report now?
I would say yes, my vote would be yes, but also, I think the issue that you brought up previously, I agree with, that ASCLD Lab has a policy that original examination records must be retained and any changes to those records must be tracked. So I think that it would make sense if ASCLD Lab is coming out to do an audit, that we ask them to just look at that issue to make sure that the lab is in compliance with that standard.
All right. What I would suggest in that regard, if we're going to pursue that course, is that maybe we ask ASCLD Lab, first of all, in the context of the audit, to the management review, I should say, not the audit, to do that, using ISO 17025 accreditation standards as the kind of the outline for that review. And then secondly, consistent with what you just indicated, ask them to look at the issues raised in the IG's report with regard to the preservation or retention of notes or other materials in files, and just make sure that there are procedures in place currently that would indicate that the lab is currently in compliance with ASCLD Lab standards in that regard. Is that reasonable? Is that something the commission wants to do? Does anyone want to make a motion in that regard?
I don't know if you need to at this point. We already have a vote to actually do this.
I don't know that we do in open session, so we're going to do it. I think we should have a motion and a vote in that regard. If that's something we want to do, then someone should make a motion that we take that action.
All right.
All right, you make a motion. Do we have a second? All right. All in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? All right, that carries. Any questions or comments from OCME with regard to that action? In terms of the IG's report, there's at least one other issue that I think we should address as a commission. My recollection of the report indicated that there were, in different spots in the report, I believe there were different statements with regard to who should be notified with regard to events of serious negligence or misconduct. My understanding is that while this commission has designated the Inspector General to investigate those issues, that the reporting of those issues should come to this commission, because I think it's important that the commission in the first instance is aware of those issues, and then the commission makes the report of the referral to the Inspector General. If that doesn't happen, we're going to be in a situation where reports go straight to the Inspector General, and this commission is not aware of instances of serious misconduct or negligence on the part of labs.
Why can't they go two ways?
Yeah.
I mean, it would seem to me
certainly can
that,
go two-
it would seem to me, let me just finish. It would seem to me that in other external auditing bodies, like in the Inspector General, which we deal with routinely in other contexts, there are two ways they receive complaints. They receive complaints directly from individuals, or they receive complaints from a body such as ours. You can ask the Inspector General that in the latter category, when they receive, in the former, when they receive complaints directly from individuals, that they then notify us and copy us on it so we can keep apprised of it.
And there's two issues I have with that. The first is that, as I read the report, there was an indication in the report that the labs were under an obligation to report to the Inspector General. And I've reviewed the consent forms that we asked the labs to sign. I've reviewed everything I could find, and I don't find where there is any obligation anywhere on the part of the labs to report directly to the IG. There is an obligation on the part of the labs to report to this commission. If they want to report to the IG on top of that, I certainly have no objection to that. But secondly, my recollection is in the past, we had this conversation with the Inspector General's office, and the Inspector General's office, as I recall, indicated to this commission that they wouldn't necessarily report matters that were reported to them back to this commission, because in some instances they might feel that that would impede or interfere with their investigation. And I don't want to be in a situation where this commission doesn't know. I think
Mike, but there's two different situations. So there's a situation where the lab becomes aware of something,
Yep.
and the lab officially notifies the commission of it,
And
okay?
that's what the report addressed.
And that goes to the IG.
That's what the IG's report
Right, but
addressed,
this-
and that's what I'm talking
But
about.
you're not talking about the situation where a lone individual in the
Nope,
laboratory.
That's not, I didn't I understood
Okay.
the Inspector General's report in one instance to tell the labs that they had an obligation to report to the IG, and I can't find where that obligation comes from. If someone, can find it or tell me where it comes from, please help me. But the obligation I'm aware of is that labs have an obligation to report directly to the commission.
Mike, if I could just address that.
Sure.
And I apologize to the commissioners. The report that you have makes the recommendation that the labs have a requirement to report to the Inspector General. I actually edited that because we had conversations with your counsel, and therefore the final publicly issued report indicates that it is a reminder to OCMA and all laboratories that they have an obligation to report, not necessarily directly to my office or to me, but to remind them they have an obligation to report those matters to the Forensic Commission, to Escalade Lab, but just, again, it's just a general reminder. So there was actually a deletion and an edit specifically to my office. And that would be consistent with prior conversations I had with you as well as members of the commission.
All right, Annette, I appreciate that, and thank you. When I did see an amended version of a report that made that change in one place but didn't make it in a second place. But if you're indicating that that change has been made throughout, I think that addresses my concern. I think, what we need to look at as a commission, is whether or not we need to do any communication to the lab, just to clarify that whoever else they report it to, we as a commission feel it's important that that information be reported to us as well. I think we could do that. If everyone's in agreement, we could just do that with a letter from the commission or from the chair of the commission to the labs, just remind you of that obligation. So if there's no objection, we'll handle that way.
Just as a point of information that Peter just made, just so it's clear, when this all was first set up, there were, and there have been over time, a number of whistleblower incidents, right? And those, can go directly to...
Absolutely. The only concern I have is I don't want labs to be left with the impression that they shouldn't be reporting to us, that the reporting should just go to the IG.
Yeah.
And I think, I appreciate the Inspector General's comments, thank you. I think that clears up the issue with regard to the report, and I think as a commission, we should just remind the labs in a correspondence, and we'll do that. Anything else with regard to the Inspector General's report? If there's not, I'd just like to take a minute. I know there's a tremendous amount of work involved in this, and I'd like to thank the Inspector General again, generally for the work you do with the Commission, and specifically for the work that you did in this case, both in terms of the investigation and the report. I think I do, and I hope I do speak for all of the Commissioners in saying we really appreciate your work, and we thank you for your work.
Thank you.
Does that bring us to new business? All right, so I think that brings us to new business. The first item we have under new business is a letter dated November 19th from the Onondaga County Center for Forensic Sciences. I don't know, is there anything you want to say with regard to that?
I guess I would like to just briefly summarize it and make a motion, if that's okay.
Okay.
And I wrote this letter basically as a lab director as well as a commission member. And the point that I'm trying to make is that similar to the field of DNA analysis, latent print analysis has the ability to link individuals to a crime. And currently, the way the law is written, only the accredited laboratories in the state that perform latent print analysis are being held to any standards at all. My opinion is that latent print analysis is a forensic science, and the Commission on Forensic Sciences has an obligation to regulate it. Given the importance of the results of the latent print work, I think it's incumbent upon us as a commission to ensure that any of the sciences that identify an individual are held to the same standards. The concern that I have is that there are a lot of agencies within the state of New York that are performing latent print analysis, and we just don't know anything about them. We don't know how many agencies there are. We don't know what their qualifications are. We don't know what their training are. We have no idea what the level of documentation is that they're doing. We really don't have any of these answers. And I want to be very clear. I am not trying to insinuate that the work that these agencies are doing is not appropriate or is not of high quality. My point is that we have no idea what the quality is. We have no idea what their training, their competency, their proficiency, their documentation. I really don't understand why we hold DNA and the latent print labs to these standards when we seem to completely ignore these other people that are doing the exact work. And I also just want to point out that anecdotally, if we look at the situations where there were issues with latent print laboratories, such as the Houston or the Boston or the St. Paul, Minnesota, when they had experts come in and review that work, about 50%, what they found is about 50% of the time, there's prints that are being missed, that are being called unsuitable, or that are not being identified to people that when the experts come in, they're saying they are suitable and they are identified. And the issue that I have with that is a lot of people want to say, well, you know, there's no one's making a false identification, it's not an issue. It is an issue if a person is falsely accused of a crime and there's a print that is ID'd to somebody else that would exonerate them, that's not happening. In addition, there's an issue of public safety that if a person could have been identified for a crime earlier and they weren't, there's an issue there. So I basically, think it's important that we do that. And again, I just want to say that I think it's important that all of the sciences that identify an individual are held to the same standards. So I have a motion that I'd like to present in relation to that.
I have an amendment to it.
Well, let me make the motion first. Then you can amend it.
I thought you made the motion.
Yeah.
No.
Oh, go ahead, make
Okay.
a motion.
So my motion, because what I think down the road we need to be looking to holding these other agencies to these standards. But as a first step, because I think before we can do that, we need to understand what's really going on and gather data about it. I think we need to understand the scope of the problem. My motion is to propose that we have DCJS perform a survey, however best they can do it, to determine the number of entities that perform latent print comparisons in the state, how many individuals that number represents, what level of training those people have had, what is the volume of comparisons that are completed per year, and do each of their examiners participate in statewide or external proficiency testing. That would be my motion as a first step to gather the data to see how we can move forward with bringing these agencies into being held to the same standards.
Needs a second.
All right.
Needs a second. Before you amend it, needs a second.
All right, do you want to?
Second.
All right, second.
Is there any
Now.
discussion?
Yeah, as the commission knows, I agree with everything that Dr. Corrado said about this and about the problem of false negatives. We
I'll
should
write
add
the
that
date down here in the
we had a, I'm sorry, what?
I'm gonna note the date and the time here.
Oh, no.
No, I'm
But
just joking.
Everything she said about
Mistaken
fingerprints, but
him for me.
I would go further. I would also, I don't think that it's, we don't need a survey to ask, to recommend to the legislature that they put all of the fingerprints under the jurisdiction of this committee, this commission, right? That would be my first amendment to the motion. And the second one is that I think we should set up a subcommittee of this commission to look at the whole issue of fingerprints, because this is changing rapidly, as you recall. We have the FBI's new method for doing what they call linear ASV, which I think certainly merits consideration as being the standard for this state. And when you begin looking at all the reports that have come out recently about the false negatives, right, which under the so-called PNOS study is as high as 7.5%, and there's not an inconsiderable number of false positives even there. And all the research that's being done on changing the standards for this, and the very considerable problem of getting this APHIS system to work nationwide, but even within the state, this is really critical. So I think that it would be useful to have a subcommittee of this commission look into this, consult with NIJ and others who are doing NIST and doing this research to try to see if we can begin to get ahead of the curve and begin to formulate maybe some standards that we could use for the fingerprint examination.
And I guess I would ask if you would, if we could deal with the working group separate, because I don't want that. I think that they're both issues warrant our consideration, but I hate to link them together. I think, the first issue is Kathy's made a motion to do the survey. You've asked to amend it to say at the same time you want to write to the legislature. The only thing I would suggest is I think our presentation to the legislature, if we're going to do it, would be much more compelling if it included data from the survey.
How long would it take to do the survey?
I think, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think in addition to being compelling, I think there's a monetary aspect, not in the parts of the labs actually doing this, but OFS now regulates 22, or actually 22 up until today, now 19 labs as the state police has put to one. There's 568 law enforcement agencies in this state. If in fact we're doing this, this is going to drastically change how our office runs and how our office works.
But I guess part of my point is we don't know.
We don't know anything.
I don't know if
Yeah.
30 of them are doing
Exactly.
fingerprints or 500 are doing fingerprints.
We
And
really don't know
really,
that.
We need
Yeah,
that
so
data to figure it out.
I would just suggest we can do the survey. Obviously, it's a heavy lift, but we'll do it, and we'll try and get it done as quick as possible. We'll try and get something back for our next meeting. Brian's telling me no. I say yes, we'll try.
I think we'll try, but to be realistic, I think there's ways we can look and see who has access to Davis terminals and et cetera, but I don't want to do this.
We can put a survey out to every police agency. We can.
I'm afraid of getting a sloppy answer, though.
Well, we will, let's go one step at a time, but I would just propose, and again, if you don't want to withdraw your motion, that's fine, we'll vote, but I would just suggest that we go one step at a time. We do the survey, with an eye toward the next step being looking at those survey results and seeing if, based on those survey results, there's a meaningful presentation.
I'll
we wanna
withdraw
make to the
my
legislature.
amendment. You want to do the survey first, and then I'll separately propose that we form a subcommittee
Okay.
to look into this, so that, because I don't want to, we know enough already that we should be doing this. It's been recommended before to the legislature, and I think it's a matter of enormous importance, so I think we should get out ahead of it, right, by having such a subcommittee.
No, I agree. I just think that with regard to the, any recommendation we make, it's important that we understand what the scope of the problem is, what the costs of the fix would be, and we will, we'll endeavor to get that survey together and get it back as soon as possible. Again, Brian says no, but my hope is we'll have something for the March meeting. So do we have a second to Kathy's motion?
So if I could just ask an
Yeah.
additional question. I certainly support the collection of data, but there is a specific exemption in statute And I assume the bill jacket has a discussion as to the justification for that exemption. Is there additional information in the bill jacket that could be addressed?
Pull it and look at it.
Information that may suggest that additional information be collected along with the items that Kathy listed. I don't want it to delay the process. Is there something in the bill jacket that
I'd have
comes
to
to your
pull the
mind?
bill jacket and look at it. I don't recall.
But it's clear we have jurisdiction over these police agencies, unaccredited.
No, we have no
We don't.
jurisdiction over police
So,
agencies.
so let's assume we do the survey.
They don't have to respond.
They don't have to respond. But B, let's say we get a response, and response is not to our liking, and it supports your view that there's this disparity, lack of training, lack of education,
It's not.
lack of standards and protocols. What would happen then
That would require a legislative change.
in the legislature?
Correct.
But not here in the commission, nothing
No,
you
but the
could...
commission could formally
Ask the
write to the
legislature.
legislature based on, I'm just saying, for us to write to the legislature saying, please make a change.
Right, you want
I think it would be
something in
much
mind.
more effective
Okay.
if we wrote to them and said, we've done a survey, and there's 323
Got it.
agencies doing this, and 8 of them are accredited, and the other, X number are not, and
Right.
here's why. So just, I believe it's a very valid point. I would like to have some data before we, to support any action we take.
Yeah, I mean, just historically, you should know that the reason for the carve-out was that there was a strong lobbying effort by upstate small law enforcement agencies that had mom-and-pop operations. They were that's where it came from, and eventually the carve-out was made.
And we'll look if there are any written materials with the.
I don't recall, I think that Richard's idea is a great idea, is just take a look if there's
Yeah, no,
anything.
we'll look.
But the recollection was, there wasn't.
Yeah,
It
no.
was just, we don't want it.
We will look, and if there's anything there, we'll get
Yeah.
it circulated to the commission. So we have a motion, we have a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? All right, that carries. Thank you. Do you have a separate motion?
Yeah,
you
I have
wanna
a
make?
separate motion that we set up a subcommittee of this commission to investigate and make to investigate the methodologies of fingerprinting, the changes that are going on, and frankly, the feasibility of us regulating it.
I think, I don't have the rules in front of me, but my recollection is that there's some issue with us setting up subcommittees, and that if we're gonna do something, I think it has to be like a working group. for
A
example.
working group.
I'm a little confused at what exactly you're asking the working group to do, though.
Well, I'll be as specific as I can, and that is that an investigation of methodologies being used to conduct fingerprint examination, all right? And to report back to the commission what they are and the merits of them. Specifically, we have the FBI's protocol with respect to so-called linear ASV, where they first look at the latent print, score it, then and only then look at the target print, and then document any discrepancies, right? There are, when you take a look at the very extensive NIJ NIST publication on prints, there's a number of other methods that are being used by fingerprint laboratories to try to validate how much information is necessary before you say this is potentially an identification or not. What the standard should be for declaring an exclusion. Is it 1 or 2 discrepancies? How do you do that? And then, of course, the operation of the automatic fingerprint identification system across the country and within the state. Considerable amount has been written about whether or not an APHIS hit ought to have a higher standard for deciding whether or not to declare that a match, because when you do an APHIS search, you're spitting out a number of close matches, right? So should the standard be the same is an issue that's been raised. So there's a considerable body of ongoing research right now that NIST, NIJ, and the FBI itself is conducting, and I know that the city actually, was it 2 years ago that we had Dr. Dror make a presentation and others, and we had a whole issue with Nassau County, right? About whether or not they were going to adopt the FBI protocol. So I think that these are all the issues that the working group should look at and report back, frankly, to this commission about what these issues are and what the implications are for what the standard should be for everyone in the state that does fingerprinting, and if we get to the point where we're going to ask the legislature to give an exemption and this commission then winds up supervising it, we'd be that far down the road. This is a field where the standards and the methodologies are changing, and it's better to be educated about this now than later.
I just wanted to make a recommendation just to throw out that maybe the commission might want to invite the chair of SWIGFAST, because I believe that a lot of the questions that you're raising can be addressed by that subject matter expert, similar to the way you brought in experts before. So I thought of the IAI, but I really think with SWIGFAST is probably going to be the most knowledgeable body on what happened, where we are now, and where they're looking to go, because they do bring together a lot of different subject matter experts, not just examiners.
I would agree, and I guess my issue, and I brought this up before, is I don't think the working group is productive unless it's made up of technical experts. And so I think hearing a presentation from SWIGFAST, which is the expert, considered the expert in the field, I think would be a good idea.
Well, that would be one of the things that such a working group would do. Believe me, there are other people who have had input into the changes that are experts as well in this area. So that would be the task of the working group, is to identify the various different people that are looking at this, their expertise, and create a real presentation for the commission in anticipation of really looking at the way it's done by the laboratories that are doing latent fingerprint analysis right now in the state of New York that we do have jurisdiction over, and in anticipation that we may well be making a recommendation to the legislature that the smaller entities that are conducting this that are outside of our jurisdiction may come within it. That's the point.
I guess I'm not trying to be argumentative. I don't, at this point, I mean, you have this working group, but I don't know what the point would, maybe if, we want to identify specific questions or something.
Yeah, they should be reviewing the new methodologies that are being used by the FBI and other laboratories in terms of how latent fingerprint examination is conducted. And report back to the commission on what this research is and what's going on.
I think it's premature to do that at this point for the reason that, first off, there's not a single subject matter expert on this commission in that area. We don't have the data yet. Once we get the data, I think we can see where we go from there. But I would have serious concern with, no offense to anybody in this commission making recommendations specifically about fingerprints when not a single person here has ever even done a fingerprint comparison. We've all read it. I'm literate on it. Many people in this commission are literate on it. You gentlemen are very literate on it. But I don't see that I would feel uncomfortable voting for that type of creation of a thing. I think at this point I would feel more comfortable with voting on this, moving forward, voting on yours, seeing where it goes, and I think from that, bringing SWIGFAST chair is an excellent idea, and then we see and evolve it and go from there. But we just lack the subject matter expertise. We're essentially creating a DNA subcommittee of people that don't know anything about DNA.
Exactly.
No.
And that's just, I don't feel comfortable with that.
Listen, I'm only arguing in favor of educating people about these issues. The point of the working group is to educate the commission on what's going on. This is a fast-moving field, right? I mean, you have the largest, the FBI has completely changed the way it does this. Does everybody think that they're so completely crazy that you shouldn't be paying attention to how they've completely reorganized it after they had a hit to a lawyer in Oregon that said that he planted a bomb in Spain that blew up the trains and was subject of this whole National Academy study? And then NIST and NIJ put together a very large study, and SWIGFAST is looking at all of this. I mean, I don't understand, Brian. Don't you want to at least have a working group here that reports back to the commission all the various different things that are going on, whether you bring in the fellow from Minnesota who's very literate, Langenberg, who's doing a lot here, or quite a number of people. You know, that's why you have lunatics like us on the commission, because we're actually following all of this. So that we can bring you up to speed. I mean, but it's nothing more than saying, let's have a working group to report back to the commission so that you can get some of the best learning. You know, it's important enough, and I'm grateful that Kathleen is pushing this now, that we maybe spend a whole day reviewing what's going on. So that, I mean, you know, truthfully, there's more prints in the APHIS system than there are DNA profiles in the CODIS system. I mean, it's a tremendously important initiative for this commission.
Barry, could we first develop an agenda for the work group that could, you know, lay out the mission and the objectives? Can you use that to solicit membership? I don't know that you could approach anyone, you know, requesting their participation without their clear understanding of the obligation to the commitment. I think it'd be more useful just to have it laid out exactly what the mission of the agenda is. And
Let me do, you know, we've got a motion on the table, and if you want it voted on, you know, if there's a second, we'll see if there's a second. If there is, we'll vote on it. My personal feeling right now is that, you know, we're gonna get survey results. We've voted on that. Yeah, I think the idea of hearing a presentation from somebody, as Chief Pulaski suggested, is not a bad idea.
Or several presentations.
I'm not personally comfortable voting to form another working group right now. You know, I would be much more comfortable if I saw something in writing outlining what the substance of the group is, but that's just my own personal feeling. So I guess at this point, you've made a motion.
Well, let me make that
with
motion specific to see if it makes you more comfortable. The motion is very simply to form a working group to seek out experts to make presentations to the commission about the recent developments in the field of latent fingerprint comparison. That's it.
All right, is there a second?
Second.
All right, we've got a motion, we've got a second. Any discussion? All right, all in favor? Yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Anyone opposed? Yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All right, so that.
Wait, I need to hear the names because I don't have the.
All right, everyone who is in favor, please raise your hand again.
Who's the fifth one? Okay. Oh, Marina. Okay.
All right. Do you need the opposed ones to raise their hand again, or do you have that?
No.
Yes, all right. Now that vote being done, I still think there are valid points that you raised, Barry, and I will ask staff to look into the idea of doing a presentation if we have time on the agenda at the next meeting. You know, and I think once we get the survey results, you know, frankly, I think it's an issue that's worth revisiting. I think, you know, there's obviously merit to the points that you raise, and it's something as a commission that we should keep on our agenda.
Well, if you're going to actually do that presentation, at the very least, I'd ask to be consulted about who you're going to bring.
You'd be open, if you're going to do that, you'd be open to other suggestions besides SWIGFAST.
Absolutely. I just...
And we don't have to necessarily do it at a commission meeting, right? Correct? You could set a date in Albany where commission members who are available could come up to Albany and listen to these presentations?
If it's commission business, it has to be a commission meeting. We can call a special meeting to do it, but, yeah. No, we'll, so I think you raise valid points. I think it's an issue as a commission, you know, that we should be mindful of. And I think once we get the survey results, you know, I'm sure we'll be addressing it again. All right, I think the next item of business, we have our lab disclosures. Brian, do you want to take us through those?
Sure. First one is the Erie County Central Police Services Forensic Laboratory. And again, Dr. Simich is here from that laboratory. And this is just a follow-up, I believe, on a previous lab disclosure. Documents are within your binder. So essentially, this is just a letter notifying Ascot Lab of a closeout of a previous car that's already been reported to the commission. The documents in your binder, Dr. Simich is available in Albany if anyone has any questions. Okay, no questions. Thank you again, Dr. Simich. I'm sorry we're not asking you for more elucidations. The next lab disclosure we have down is the New York City Office of Chief Medical Examiner. There's a CODIS upload issue. So this is again coming from the Estes one loci mismatch search. And the 4 candidate matches were discovered, profiles from 2007 to 2012 on the 4 cases, and then the root causes found 1 mixture interpretation error, 2 transcription errors, and handwritten notes that were not inputted into CODIS.
Can I find out some more about that mixture misinterpretation error?
Yes, I'll let Eugene answer that question.
Sure. The laboratory has mixture interpretation guidelines, and we currently have guidelines to guide the analyst as to how.
Is that you're looking at
I'm
electrocardiogram
looking
there?
at
Is that in
electrocardiogram
our
right now.
is that in our
No,
materials?
it's not. I just want to make sure that I'm letting you know exactly what had happened.
Right.
So I have my notes here with me.
Yeah.
So
There's another copy of that I'd love to see it.
Okay.
Just so I can actually read it.
The laboratory has mixture interpretation guidelines, and we have tech review processes to make sure that all the mixtures that have been deduced were properly deduced and uploaded. In this instance, unfortunately, there was one location in which there was a misinterpretation. I had taken a look at this, and I believe our CODIS administrator and the laboratory had taken a look at this, and it was indeed an interpretation error. I believe the interpretation to be a little bit too aggressive. I would have either made the location inconclusive, or I would have inserted a Z, so to say, that there's an obligate allele, but then there might be other alleles that might be present. So it was an interpretation error that we had made.
But when you which methodology were you using? What year was this?
This was from a 2011 case.
Right. So you weren't using the forensic statistical tool,
No.
or were you?
No.
Okay.
The forensic statistical tool does not do mixture interpretation. It does a likelihood ratio. It calculates a likelihood
Right, but
ratio.
you weren't using this for determining.
No.
Right. So
couldn't do
what
any of that.
what allele did you miss? I mean, what locus and why was it missed?
FGA.
And
So there.
was this something that fell below your RFU cutoff? Is that
So
what happened?
the original interpretation was a 1922 at the FGA,
Yeah.
and the target, which matched, was a 2224. Okay, so what do you mean when you say it did a fall below?
So, no, wait a
RFU
second, so
threshold?
you're saying that the actual genotype in retesting became what?
No, not the actual genotype. The one locus mismatch individual was a whatever it was.
Was a right.
22,
The
24.
person was a 2224 and your testing got a 1922?
No, not
we
our
had
testing.
3 alleles.
Our testing revealed 3 alleles, which is 19, 22, and 24.
Right.
Okay, so the interpretation that the analyst made was that it was a 1922 at that location, which differs from the target of 2224. And this is where the mismatch produced it for us to review to see whether or not it's a true mismatch or if it's a...
And was there, so in other words, they were saying that, was this a vaginal swab or what was it?
This was a steering wheel swab.
Steering wheel. And so there was some interpretation that the primary contributor was a 1922 instead of a 2224. Is that what you're telling me? And well, why was that?
The 19 and the 22 were the largest alleles height-wise at that location, but the 19 allele was visible but not called in the second amplification. So the person looked at all the data and said, I believe that the profile is a 1922. But in actuality, it was the 22 and the 24. The 24 dropped out in the other amplification.
So in the second, and what is your, I mean, what's your
So
root
what
cause analysis here? Why would it drop out in the second amplification?
there was a very long, due to the fact that this is at least a 3-person mixture, that means that the amount of DNA that was there to start with, considering that there's 3 people there, was a rather low amount of DNA. And so when you have multiple contributors, not a great amount of DNA, it's possible that you can have drop out of one of the contributors, especially at this location, which is a location that can have and is known to have dropout.
Anyway, one doesn't. Could you just forward to us all the underlying data on this, the entire case, the entire. If you want to anonymize it, you know, that's quite all right. But just the underlying scientific data with respect to why you got the drop in and drop out here. And my question would be, at this locus, did you go back and look at any other cases where you got this kind of drop in and drop out?
We have, in our manual, there is guidance on when you have a low amount of DNA at locations where you can potentially have dropout, to be more cautious about making a call like this, which is why Eugene said that this was a more aggressive call. Our guidelines do suggest to have more caution.
But I guess that those are such general terms. I mean, what do you mean by aggressive or caution here? I don't get it. I guess I don't want to burden us with further discussion of this. If you could just send us the relevant portions of your manual, the relevant underlying data, then I would be able to formulate some better questions for you
Would it
than
be
just right
appropriate to
now.
have those sent to the DNA subcommittee instead to look at?
No, I mean, you know, Mike,
They
you
have
just
the
got to get a
expertise.
grip on
We-
this.
we
They're
discussed
not
this.
dealing with this issue in a way that's appropriate yet.
Who's not doing it?
The DNA subcommittee has not been dealing with this question of low template, drop in, drop out, in an aggressive way. And, you know, hopefully we'll stimulate them to do it, but it's a serious problem. I mean, that's all. And so I'd like to see this data. I'd like to see this data. I have no hidden agenda
In addition, I'm
here.
asking that you please send it to the DNA subcommittee, or send it to Brian and he'll forward it to the subcommittee.
But we'll get it, right? All right, and
In addition, right?
Anonymized.
anonymize.
Right.
I mean, but
Send it to Brian. We'll look at it, make sure it's anonymized, there's nothing that would be inappropriate to circulate, and we'll circulate.
right, I'm
what
trying
we
to
can.
get to the scientific merits of it,
I
and and there's nothing in these rules that would in any way prevent me from sending this to other experts for their analysis. Well, better not be.
If that's what you intend to do, then I'm not comfortable with that at this point.
Well, I'd like it, and
Yeah, we're gonna take
we'll
case
better have a
materials and
discussion
circulate them
about it.
around the country.
I'm sorry?
We're gonna take case materials and start circulating them around the country now.
I think when a lab discloses stuff to OFS or to the commission, they do so with the knowledge it stays within the commission. I think it would threaten the way we work in New York and make it much more adversarial should we take this information and shop around for opinions on it, whether they be right or wrong, not going to the quality of those opinions. I think New York State is one of the few states in the country that's a panel of nationally renowned experts from around the country that can actually participate. I think after that, if the data is presented to you, not my decision, but my opinion, it should be restricted to you, as any commission document should be.
And there's penalties for inappropriate release of the
Right.
data, so.
Mike?
Yes.
The commission meeting, the DNA subcommittee meeting preceded this when we had this a disclosure. We talked at some length to that subcommittee about the data already. It's so, you know, they've addressed this particular question already. So I think the commission should see what they wrote or discussed.
No, I absolutely intend to do that. I guess back to your request, Barry, you know, I'm comfortable asking that the material be sent to Brian, that we review it to make sure there's nothing that's inappropriate to circulate to commission members, and then circulate it to commission members with the understanding that it doesn't get circulated beyond that unless and until a commission member comes back to the commission, if they intend to or want to circulate it, tells the commission exactly what they want to do with it, and there's a decision of the entire commission as to whether or not it would be appropriate to circulate or not.
All right, well, look, let's start with that, all right? I don't think that's appropriate. That is to say, it seems to me that when we're talking about scientific data, we're talking here about interpretations of low template DNA and mixtures. We're talking about the manual of OCME. It makes no sense to me that why a commissioner looking at this data can't show this to other experts in the field if it's anonymized. That seems to me the notion is that we have a DNA subcommittee, and the DNA subcommittee, if they approve it, that's it, and nobody would send it to any other DNA experts because we assume that they're the be-all and end-all of DNA expertise.
Well, to what end, Barry? Because I've testified previously that you can get a room full of forensic DNA scientists and they'll all interpret it slightly differently.
Okay,
So that's going to be the answer.
Hang on, no.
That's
Stop,
not the answer.
stop. You've made a request.
Yes.
I've indicated that if you're willing to live with the guidelines I set forward, then we'll proceed with the request. If you're not, then I'm not
Mike,
comfortable providing it this way.
Let me point this out to you. Not only am I willing to live with those guidelines, but if anything, right, I probably am subject to criticism for not revealing things, right, to the public that we've kept quiet for far too long over the last 14 years, including sensitive investigations. Now, frankly, I can actually read this myself and figure it out because, we're dealing with cases like this. And I'm trying to tell you, in no uncertain terms, that the answer that Tim just gave, well, we could sit down and we could have a lot of different DNA analysts interpret this differently, is exactly the problem. I'm trying to make that clear to you.
Now, the issue before us is...
Yeah, I'll take a look at it. I want to have a look at it so I can perform my personal oversight function. I'm entitled to that. I will not take the step of showing it to another expert without asking for the consent of the commission. And frankly, because I don't want to litigate that issue in a contentious way right now, but I would commend to your attention, you ought to give it some thought, because it's crazy to say that I can't show it to another expert once it's properly analyzed.
I think we've got a resolution. You'll provide the information that was requested to Brian, and we'll proceed as we indicated. Thank you. Any other questions for OCME on this issue?
Thank you again.
Thank you.
The next concern under lab disclosures is the Nassau County Office of Chief Medical Examiner Toxicology Laboratory. We have Dr. Avila, Mr. Hahn from that laboratory here, updating us on a corrective action. Gentlemen? So you have documents that are in here. This issue has been previously presented to the commission. So we're just wondering if there's any inquiries for these gentlemen. Dr. Kennedy?
I do have a couple of questions. I apologize, I wasn't here last meeting. I don't know what was discussed. But it comes down to competency assessment. Does your laboratory have a written protocol for competency assessment?
Could you define that a little bit? I mean, I know that's an ASCLD, often used ASCLD type term. Could you just expand on what you're...
Initially, there's training.
Yes.
Subsequently, there's an assessment as to whether or not that individual, the analyst, was successful in that training,
Yes.
understands the SOPs, and executes those procedures according
Yes.
to your approved policies. And presumably, periodically, there's an ongoing assessment of that competency.
Yes.
And I'm asking if there's guidance to whoever conducts those competency assessments as to what's included in the assessments. So the first question is there a written policy on competency assessment, the frequency and the procedures that are used in those competency assessments?
Okay. We don't define it as such, as in terms of competency is the way... But yes, to answer your question, we have a written protocol of training. The individual was not allowed to begin performing this type of casework until she had completed a proficiency test. She, as a matter of the way that the laboratory operates, we have testing that is performed on a laboratory basis. So it can be done by multiple individuals that all contribute to it. And then there are tests that are specific to the analyst. She participated in all of those prior to assuming this particular type of casework.
Okay, so subsequent to the initial training and competency assessment, is there recurring evaluation of competence?
Well,
periodically, annually?
In terms of, I mean, as I say, these proficiency tests are conducted yearly. So in terms of additional training?
Well, is there direct observation of an analyst's practices occasionally by supervisory personnel?
Well, I mean, supervisory
to verify that,
staff.
in fact, individuals are following procedures.
Yeah, I mean, supervisory staff is on hand. I think one of the corrective actions that we made, and I think I mentioned this, was that by creating a situation where it would be obvious at a glance if there was a deviation from the protocol, and I think that at least in part addresses what you're suggesting. Yes, there is supervisory staff on hand at all times. Naturally, they can't be present at every moment. However, by making the change that we did, I believe it enhanced the ability to very quickly identify if there's any deviation.
Where I'm going with this is, you know, in reading your timeline and the incident, I asked myself the question as to, well, why wasn't this discovered over a period of time of direct observation by supervisory personnel that this one analyst breached protocol and that person was working with more than one specimen at any one time? Was that routine practice on that individual's part, or was it an isolated incident where 2 kits were taken and opened?
You know, that came to the point where, you know, why did this exactly happen? Why did she deviate? The individual accepted responsibility. She knew the protocol. She accepted responsibility for doing that. I've come to the conclusion after all of the interviews that I've made that this was as isolated a case as it could be. She indicated that she did this perhaps 1 or 2 times, only in those cases where she was working on 2 cases at one time. When she felt that she had 3 or more, obviously when you have 1 case, it's not an issue at all. When she had 3 or more, she never did it. She, in 1 or 2 instances, had 2 cases open at one time. It happened to be, it caused this issue. So there was never based upon that, I don't know that a supervisor would have had the opportunity to catch it because we caught it relatively early. It just so happens. Had this been ongoing for months, I would assume that at some point we would have caught it. But we do not have the practice of observing the individual as they perform this aliquoting in every situation.
Yeah, that's one of the challenges for accreditation programs in, you know, defining what a competency assessment program actually entails. I can say in the clinical laboratory industry, the federal government actually lays out 6, 7 requirements of a competency assessment program. One of those requirements is, first of all, that competency assessment be done minimally, at least annually, for each analyst. And one of the practices is direct observation, so that in fact a supervisor is observing an analyst for all that person's functions to verify that in fact that analyst is compliant with SOP. So reading ASCLD lab requirements and ABFT both require competency assessment, but there's no detail as to what constitutes an effective and, well, required program for competency assessment. So if in fact your practice is not to have supervisory observation of practices, you know, SOP on one hand, observing practices on the other, I suggest that is certainly a good lab practice. It's not just a message to you, but you know, to all laboratories. I hope by this transparency in this discussion that in fact all laboratories learn from one's incident and error root cause identification, corrective action.
Okay, and I'll take that constructive criticism. I just would point out and add that during the training process, there is an observation of this type of exactly going through the protocol, having the procedure in hand and watching. So it's not as if that, I just don't want to leave the impression that that was never done.
But bad habits develop over time.
Right.
And they have to be called,
Point taken.
you know, responsible. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything further?
Thank you, gentlemen. Last item under lab disclosures is the New York State Police. There's two issues. The first is an update on the previous, and then the second is a new report. We have, again, the System Director, Ray Wickenhausen, and maybe Tim Monroe. Yep, there we go. Up in Albany. Okay. So the documents are present in all your binders. Does anyone have any questions for the gentleman from the State Police? Okay. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
All right, I believe that's everything that we have on our open agenda. Before we break, there was one other thing I wanted to do. Dr. Jenny has indicated that he wants to step off the commission, I believe in anticipation of your retirement. And I think there's a significant possibility that this might be your last meeting. So I did just want to take a minute on behalf of the entire commission to thank you for your years of service to the commission. You certainly have brought a much needed perspective. It's obvious from your presentations here that you always come very prepared. We appreciate all the work that you put in, both outside of the commission and during the course of the meetings. We did bring a few things for you.
I'm stepping down.
Since you're taking the track back, we have an anvil that we have monogrammed for you.
What are they going to give me?
We do have a plaque for you here from the commission, just again in recognition of your dedicated service and your many contributions to the New York State Commission on Forensic Science. We'll give that to you as a small token of our thanks. Just to, again, have a letter here from the commission signed by me as chair of the commission. Again, thanking you for your service. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I think it's 2005. Time flies. Actually, this is a surprise. I didn't realize I was going to be terminated today.
You're not being terminated, but the way it works is when they do appoint somebody else, then your term automatically expires. He was not thrown off. He asked to be taken off. So.
I had acknowledged to Brian over a year ago that I would be retiring from state service in 2014. And I was up for renewal in October, I believe, of 2013. And I asked not to be considered for renewal of that appointment.
Who appoints you, by the way?
Pardon?
Who recommends your position?
The Department of
Department
Commissioner
of
of Health.
It's been really an exciting 8 years. I've learned so much from the commission members. Personally, I think the legislature got it right. The stakeholders are represented in this commission, the expertise and the perspectives that are brought to the commission, they've proven themselves to be highly effective. I highly respect the passion that everyone brings, to this commission in the sharing of expertise. The OFS, all these years, Kathy and your staff, I know you're overwhelmed, but I thank you for the seamless coordination of these meetings and the numerous requests for information. You've always come through, and I always appreciate that. The accrediting organizations, we've been hard on them over the years. We will continue to be. Obviously, we depend on those accrediting organizations to provide a work product that we use to make informed decisions about New York State accreditation. So we're highly dependent upon them to create a work product that is clear to us so that we have the appropriate discussions to make the correct decisions. So I do thank the accrediting organizations for working with us. Expect that will continue. And of course, the laboratories. You know, as a lab director, I certainly appreciate the challenges in operating the laboratory. I don't have the pleasure of having to appear before this commission. Clearly I'm being facetious. It's a very stressful situation. But as I mentioned to Joe, you know, the transparency of the commission and the laboratories, you know, airing problems identified in laboratories, you know, what happens in one laboratory, all labs are subject to the same risk. And through airing, you know, the errors and corrective action, and root cause analyses, all labs should certainly be benefiting from that discussion. And you know, the process instills confidence in laboratories that yes, errors occur, we know why they occur, we address those root causes, and expect that operations will certainly improve down the line. So it's been a very rewarding participation on my part in the commission. I'm deeply honored and privileged to have worked with each of the commission members present and past. Thank you very much.
Thank you. At this point, I believe we've completed all of the business with regard to open session. We do have a matter or matters for executive session, so I would ask if we have a motion to go into executive session to discuss information relating to a current investigation which could jeopardize the investigation if disclosed, or that may lead to promotion, demotion, discipline, suspension, dismissal, or removal of a particular person. Do we have such a motion?
So moved.
All right, second? All right, all in favor?
Aye.
All right, so we will go into executive session. I would ask the IG, if there's someone from the IG's office in open session, or could you just go back in?
No, you need a motion, right?
Yeah.
Motion to go back into open session.
All right, a second?
I'm gonna miss you.
All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? All right, we did not take any action in executive session. Any formal action needs to be reported. Do we have any other issues in open session before we adjourn?
Well, yeah, I have a motion, and the motion is that we release the transcripts of the statements that were given during the executive session, as well as the correspondence that we sent to the mayor's office, I guess it was, so that the public can understand what the course of this investigation was and what we did.
Is there any discussion with regard to that?
What are you talking about?
Why don't you come up to the table if you want?
Mike could help you summarize it.
You asked for a discussion about a question, I have no idea what you're talking about.
Go ahead.
Yeah, in other words, when, just so you know, when the Inspector General was looking into the Sarita Mitchell matter, right, and other issues that arose at OCME, they had asked us to keep in executive session our questions of all of Ms. Butcher, of, I guess, Tim, you testified, of Dr. Prince, who else?
Me.
What?
Dr. Sampson.
Yes. Oh, and Dr. Sampson, of course, I didn't see that. And so, so all those things were done in executive session because we were proceeding that way not to jeopardize the IG investigation. That was the reason that it was done in executive session. And we also sent some correspondence in connection with that investigation. So,
which we also kept confidential.
Which we also
for the
kept
same
confidential.
reason.
Right.
Correspondence to whom?
The I think it was a letter to
the mayor, I believe.
To the mayor.
We're aware of that letter.
Right. Yes. And so the point is that we're moving now to reveal, to make all this public, because the only reason that all those documents and the answers that were given, which were not under oath, were done in executive session was out of deference to the IG, who asked us to do it that way. Otherwise, we would have done it in open session. So now that the IG's investigation is finished, the motion is to make all that public. Just, and we're bringing you in here because, you know, we.
If I understand you, Barry, what you're saying is that normally that would have been done in open session.
That's correct.
The only reason that we did it in executive session is because there was a pending IG investigation. They specifically asked it to be done that way. And if I understand what you're saying now, you're saying the investigation's done, the report has been issued, and that there's no reason for that to still be considered executive session material.
Exactly.
All right. Is there any either comment, discussion, argument from either commission members, or is there any comment that anyone from OCME would like to make with regard to this issue?
May I ask, does the commission have a history or a prior precedence of making public discussions in executive session? Have you done that previously? Or would we be the very first occasion that you have done that?
No, I think that in virtually every instance where a matter arose initially that could have resulted in where either the investigating agency, because of a whistleblower complaint, or that went to the IG, eventually the IG issued a report, everything became public, but are just other investigations where I can think of a few where Phil Pulaski said, I'm investigating this, and then presented the lab disclosures in executive session. Eventually, everything was public.
I'm not so sure about that.
I don't know that to be accurate.
We didn't take.
We've never had transcripts
We never had
before, but they are releasable.
The substance, but the substance of what was being reported to us eventually became public in the reports that they issued.
No, I would say that if the OIG is involved in the report and they did a final report, obviously that is public. But if there is an issue discussed in executive session, such as some sort of a lab issue, if it was discussed and if there was no continuing action, it didn't necessarily be public.
And there were many issues discussed in executive
But
session.
but one second, has there ever been a single situation where after the investigation was over, any member of the commission explicitly asked that it be then made public and the commission voted it down?
No.
Right. So
May I ask you, the executive session that you held where you spoke with Dr. Sampson, Barbara Butcher, and Tim, there was a court reporter, there was a transcript?
Yeah.
And does the commission have a long-standing practice and history of having a court reporter present and having a transcript generated in executive session? Or was this the first occasion that it was done?
Your behavior and demeanor during executive session was very different than it would have been in a public session, to the point where you sequestered us out in that room where we couldn't talk amongst ourselves. And those rules placed on us were inappropriate to now release to the public.
if you have a problem with those rules, so you'd be able to comment on it, and if you wanted to in any way criticize the manner in which those Q&As went, you're free to comment on that also. But that's a separate question. The point is that once something starts out confidential solely because there was a pending Inspector General's review going on, once that's over, members of the commission are free to ask that it be released. That's why I asked Catherine if in fact there's ever been another occasion where someone had asked that it be released and the commission was told, no, we can't do that. So there's no precedent for that.
I'm going to make an executive decision here. Out of fairness to OCME, I think they deserve the opportunity to at least have a chance to look at this issue and respond. Barry's made the motion's pending, and before we vote on it, I'm going to give the OCME an opportunity to respond to the commission, and then at our next meeting, assuming there's a second, we'll vote on it after hearing or considering their input.
Commissioner, I appreciate that courtesy, and thank you for extending that to the OCME, because it is certainly something that we need to go back and speak to our counselors at the law department
No, I think
and
it's
in
an
the mayor's
important
office.
issue. I think they raise important points, but I think in fairness, I don't think it should be decided, without giving everyone the opportunity to be heard fully on it.
And may I ask, I had asked the question, in the executive session that we're speaking about, there was a court reporter and a transcript generated. Is there prior instances or a history of that occurring, or was this the first instance of an executive session generating a transcript?
Yeah, obviously my history with the commission is limited, so I can't answer that, but I can tell you that the...
We can.
Was it the first occasion, in your experience, Commissioner, that a transcript was generated for executive session?
In the year and 3/4 that I've been here, yes.
I can give you a better answer for your purposes if you wanted. I don't remember that ever happening.
We're gonna get back to them. Okay.
All right, we'll wait your
By the way,
submission.
have you reviewed that transcript for corrections?
We've never received a transcript.
Oh, you've never received that transcript?
No.
Oh, that's right, because you didn't, it was an executive
Executive
session. We couldn't give it to you.
We'll get you a copy.
Right, so.
Who would you like that to go to?
I would move for this purpose, if you're, would it be okay to give, would you want that transcript now?
Yes.
Okay,
I have no objection to providing it.
I think in fairness, you should get it, and what we would appreciate are any corrections, you think, that, because sometimes court reporters get those
In
wrong.
addition to the transcript, do you have any objection to providing them the video?
No.
All right.
Look at both of us.
No, but I think Barry's point's well taken. In addition to them making whatever argument they make about why it shouldn't be released to the general public, that if they find anything that they believe is factually inaccurate, just as we would with any transcript and any other pleading, that they add that to their response.
Yeah, no, we'll consider anything that they want to give us
Right.
in terms of a response.
Right.
This
We
will-
don't have a date for our next meeting, but I think we're looking at dates in March. right?
Yeah, and you're looking at a transcript that's between the two sessions, probably about 400 pages.
Yes.
So it's going to be a little bit of an undertaking to go through in detail, annotate for you.
Brian, these lawyers, 400 pages is nothing for them.
Now, if you can get us something before the end of February, obviously, we'd appreciate as a commission a little bit of time to consider the response.
You should have a first thing in the morning from me. And the video, what I'll do is I'll send you an electronic PDF copy of the transcript. And what I'll do is I'll also send you
Brian, could you please send that to Dr. Sampson directly,
Sure.
and to include Barbara Butcher, Tim, and myself?
Yeah, without
Thank
doubt.
you.
And the video, we'll make DVDs of the videos and send those to you as well.
All right, thank you. Anything else? Is there a motion to adjourn?
What about the next date?
We can set it
have to
now
work
if
it
you
out.
want, or we can just, I'd rather just have staff
We'll
figure
get
out
that
what
to
the
you.
best date is and do it.
End of March.
All in favor?
All in favor.
Thank you.
Thanks.